And for those who enjoy this channel and would love to support us financially, please feel free to hit that donate link. We'd greatly appreciate it. God bless. Subscribed yet? Please hit that subscribe button.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Modern Day Debates. My name is Nicholas Suter. I am standing in for James. No, he did not suddenly get much more dashing and handsome. I am standing in for him. He is unfortunately unable to make it, but he wanted the debate to continue, and so we will be debating today. We are having a Lion's Head debate, an atheist versus two creationists. The atheist is going to be Jordan. Jordan, if you want to say hello there. And although he's muted, we're all
sorry.
Muted.
I had so many mutes going on. Yeah, I'm Jordan. I don't know if you want me to introduce myself. From Reason to Doubt with a 2. I'm a mechanical and nuclear engineer, and sometimes on the weekends I do stuff like this.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for coming. And on the affirmative, we're debating, does the evidence support a literal interpretation of Genesis? And for the affirmative, we have Raw Matt and Standing for Truth. Matt, how are you?
I'm doing good. It's my second debate here, so exciting. Always.
And that means I've been here for 100% of your debates as well.
That's
is what that
right.
means.
Yep, you and me.
Well, like I said, I'm bummed that you don't have the Tutankhamun thing, but okay, fine. James is such a spoil sport. And we also have Standing for Truth. Standing for Truth, welcome.
Thanks, Nick. Happy to be here. Thanks, Jordan, for doing this. Thanks, Nick, for moderating, and thanks, Praise, for hosting. Really looking forward to this.
All right. Well, so as I said, the topic is, does the evidence support a literal interpretation of Genesis? We are going to have 12-minute openings for each side. Now, what that means is that Raw Matt and Standing for Truth will actually have to split the time between them. I believe they've already arranged how they're going to do that. Jordan will have, of course, the full time for his side. 10-minute rebuttals for each side. Then we're going to have a 30-minute open discussion. And then we will have an 8-minute closing from each side. Now, I've said this before, and I already talked to the participants here. As a mod, I do believe one of my jobs is to make sure that the debate continues on smoothly. There's always going to be miscommunication, and there's always going to be talking past each other. That's part of a debate. But if it gets to the point where we're really going in circles, people are saying the same thing over and over and over again, if there's a way that I can sit there and maybe try to reframe it and interject something and just get the debate moving forward, nobody wants a dumpster fire. Well, that's not true. Plenty of people want a dumpster fire. If you want a dumpster fire, today is not the day to do it. I think we'd all like to see the debate moving forward, whichever side is ahead or whatever you want to argue. We'd like to see forward progress. So if it looks like we're really stuck, I will interject and try to dislodge it. I don't always.
I'm sorry, I was just looking at the live chat. A bunch of people are saying there's an echo. So I'm not sure. It could be somebody who has the live stream on at the same time as their as it's going on. So I'm not sure. They're just saying there's an echo. I'm not sure.
It's probably, I would assume it's on Praise I Am's side. Now, that's because he is, unless somebody else hears an echo with me, but I would assume that is his OBS client, and he may have, this happens if the, you have the mic also going through the desktop, especially when you set it up with, what is it? We're using Zoom. Yeah. So sometimes Zoom, his mic may, we can try that, but thank you. I hadn't caught any.
Apparently it's been fixed. So whoever praised it, that was you. Good job. The audience says we're all good. Sorry.
He muted himself. Sound is still out of sync, but he muted himself. I think that may have done it. So if he mutes himself, that may help. Now he's going to be helping with the super chats and or with the time. I can also do the time, and it may be that I will try to also do the time as well. I may miss it, but between the two of us, we'll try to keep an eye on the time and the super chats, and we will see what's what. So is everybody all set? Are we sort of clear on what we're going to be doing tonight? Perfect. All right. The affirmative is that the evidence does support a literal interpretation of Jesus, and I believe Matt is going first for the affirmative. Is that correct?
I think standing is actually. I'm going to take
all
over
right.
time he doesn't use.
All right. And standing for truth, it is all yours, and I'll start the timer. And you wanted to split the time evenly, so I am giving you 6 minutes.
Awesome. Let me just share this first before you start the timer. Let me get all set here.
All right, so I started the timer when I did my intro. You got 2 minutes left.
Oh, that leaves me about 30 seconds. I better talk fast.
Aren't you glad I'm modding? I want to retract that Nick's fair statement. Okay.
Oh, now I only got 20 seconds. Thanks, Nick.
No problem.
All right, guys. Okay, we can start now. Thanks for doing this. Like I said earlier, we got biblical creation, Genesis, and science. Is Genesis consistent with empirical science? The Bible in Genesis tells us that we were created in his image. And therefore, if we look at how humans have made things, created things, designed things, for example, this can then give us an idea or an inspiration into the patterns in which God may have used to ultimately create things in the beginning. Now, naturally, we as humans have and do design things with groups within groups patterns. If you were to look at the types of vehicles or modes of transportation humans have created, they naturally form groups within groups patterns. For example, a sedan has a tremendous amount of similarities with other sedans. Now, a semi-tractor trailer is obviously much different than a sedan or a car, but these two modes of transportation are similar enough to each other that it sets them apart from airplanes. This is the groups within groups pattern that emerges when we look at all the modes of vehicles or transportation that humans have designed. What is this? This is an empirical observation, and this is something we naturally do. Why wouldn't God do the same thing? Why couldn't God create specific kinds of creatures in the beginning that are different from us as humans, as well as kinds of creatures that are more similar to us? Therefore, nested hierarchies in DNA are also predicted by creationists based on this design model. The classification of life can be compared to classification of modes of transportation on how different companies manufacture cars based on their similarities, forming hierarchies. Biblical creation has a multitude of lines of evidence. For example, humans are fundamentally different from all other forms of life when we consider genomics and functionality. We also see that genetic change is actually down and not up. We are therefore devolving due to mutation accumulation. Natural selection cannot stop this mutation accumulation. A question I would have for Jordan would be, what type of selection can rid the population of so many mutations that are pouring in, that are unselectable, that are nearly neutral, slowly degrading our genome? Another one that comes to mind is information in general. The information in our genomes cannot arise through mutation and natural selection, as we know that there exists multiple overlapping codes in our DNA. All you have to do is picture receiving an email and finding that it has 3 totally different messages, where you get one message when read normally, one message when read in reverse, and one when reading every other letter. What does this indicate? This indicates data compression at the highest level, which extends far beyond any computer program ever written by man. Our genome is polyfunctional and polyconstrained. Any change, no matter how minute, will have an effect. The junk DNA era has been completely overturned and is no longer a valid form of evidence for evolutionists. Molecular clocks, for example, and other dating methods most consistently point to a young genome. Even fossils. The fossil record, what does it support? It supports massive death and burial on a global scale. This is exactly what the Bible describes. The existence of a fossil in general is proof that it happened quickly. Let's look at our hypothesis, the created heterozygosity hypothesis. Now, genetically, what it goes back to is this idea of big A, big B, little b. It's pre-existing functional DNA differences. Now, if Adam and Eve were created genetically homogeneous with no variety in their DNA, all capital letters or all lowercase letters, for example, then of course, the evolutionists would have a point, because it would be difficult to create the variety that we see in just a few thousand years. And that's a common evolutionist objection to the biblical creation model. And this too goes for the kinds of animals God created, Adam, Eve, and these specific created kinds, with capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b. And if you do that for the millions of DNA positions that actually exist in the genome, that means they have the potential to produce all sorts of variety in a single generation. We've now got multiple lines of evidence indicating that this was the case, that God created Adam, Eve, and the kinds in the beginning. So they have the potential within themselves to produce all sorts of variety. And in the case of animal kinds, all sorts of species in what some would call an evolutionary heartbeat. Evolutionists assume mutations as a source of all variety and reject the idea of front-loaded genetic variety. Evolutionists state, no, this is all a process of genetic mistakes, which precludes from even considering the possibility that there is front-loaded genetic variety and created DNA functional differences from the start. They have then missed this incredible explanation for how millions of species and incredible variety could have come about in just a few thousand years. In regards to how long?
20 seconds. Sorry, I should have given you 20 seconds.
In regards to animal species, we can see the echo of this hypothesis in the breeds that have been formed, which are formed by pre-existing genetic variety. This hypothesis is not ad hoc because it makes testable predictions on speciation rates, mutation rates, the forming of species, as well as DNA function. Matt, do you want me to take an extra minute just to finish this off, brother?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. For example, it makes specific predictions on junk DNA, and the trajectory of discovery now favors genome-wide functionality. For sake of time, Jordan and I can discuss that in the discussion portion. There are three main events in Scripture, specifically in Genesis, which is what we're defending here, that we can address with modern genetics: the creation of Adam and Eve, the flood of Noah, the Tower of Babel. In Matt's time, he's going to cover some of that stuff, mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Adam, for example. I'll end it here with this chart. Have a look at this visually. We can make testable predictions. The creationists are the ones making the future testable predictions. It is widely known that human mitochondrial DNA differences, they divide into three major groups designated L, M, and N. And you can see this in this graph here, this mitochondrial DNA map. These are the three major haplogroups. The history of humanity is in our genome. What we actually know about mitochondrial DNA of humans fits the biblical base model. The model explains the three haplogroups and the relative differences pre- and post-flood humanity. I want to see Jordan address this and also make better testable predictions on this mitochondrial DNA map. We know mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively from mothers.
You're a bit over time, and I'm taking a bit more from Matt, just FYI.
Perfect. Almost done here. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Now, what's important here is there were three young women. They were married women on the ark who would have repopulated the earth after the flood 4,500 years ago. The fact that there are three major haplogroups of human mitochondrial DNA in the world is amazing confirmation of this model and of a literal interpretation of Genesis, because these predictions, the retrodictions, these hypotheses are flowing perfectly from Genesis. Also very consistent is the Babel dispersion, where one would expect sudden formation of several variants in human mitochondrial DNA due to rapid separation and isolation of various groups of people. Now, on this tree and map of humanity, the three major haplogroups are joined by relatively short line segments, indicating that there's not much difference between them. This is consistent with a pre-flood world of only 10 generations, long ages, being that there are little differences between them. These women came from a world where only a few generations had lived before them. And from these three major nodes emit dozens of mitochondrial DNA variants, each at a relatively greater distance than the three major haplogroups, if you're looking at this map, of course. Obviously, since Babel, there have been many generations accounting for the relatively larger distances between the dozens of mitochondrial DNA variants we see today and the three major haplogroups from which they have emerge. This is incredible and irrefutable. We can get into the specific testable predictions on mapping the history of civilization and mutation rates in the most divergent of African people groups, the Khoisan peoples, for example. We can touch on that in the discussion portion. Take over, Matt.
Matt, you got 3:30.
All right. Okay, well, he gave you 3 major predictions. I'll give you some more because Genesis makes a lot of claims. It's not a science book, but it makes specific statements. The Bible in the very beginning does state that there was a beginning. It mentions that in the beginning. Was there a beginning to all things? Well, yes, we know today that there was. And the Bible is very clear. And this was a time when everyone thought that the universe was eternal. So it's pretty strict and it clarifies that. The Bible also said that God made man in the beginning, and there were just 2 people, and all people came from those 2 people. And I would love for Jordan to prove that mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam weren't the first people, but the only contention that he or anyone can actually have are the dates of those people. So because I'm low on time, I'll leave that for the discussion portion. Next, we have that God put Adam to sleep, and he took from his side the rib where he made Eve. What does science tell us about ribs? Well, the rib is the only bone in the human body that can regrow once it's been removed. This is not a case with a single primate. This is from a book that was supposedly written by sheep herders 5,000 years ago that got this right. Well, what about the color? What color was Adam and Eve, and where were they created, and why does it matter? Well, the Bible says that they came from the Middle East, out of the Fertile Crescent. Well, what do people look like that live there? They all have brown skin, right? Yet secular science tells us that man evolved out of Africa, and they would have had black skin if they were Africans. Well, what does science tell us about skin colors? Well, skin color is governed by genes, and genes come in pairs. 2 pairs from each parent inherited. For this discussion, let's say that it's A and G for these genes, right? So now brown colored pigment skin, people contain a lowercase a and an uppercase. Let's say they're lower cases. So sorry, I kind of messed that up. Black people would have the gene that is all uppercase, right? So a capital A, and a capital G, G. Light-skinned people would carry lowercase a, and a GG gene. But brown-skinned people would have the uppercase A and a lowercase a, containing within them all the variants for all of the races that we see in the world today. So they had to be brown-skinned people from that area. They were not black. So that disproves the out of Africa theory. Next, we're going to be that God taught Adam language and Adam named the animals. What do we have today? Well, when we're looking at p-value, which is scientific statistical hypothesis, everything is based off of that. So we know, based on the human language acquisition from the 1960s, that all of the stochastic models that have ever existed, nobody over the age of 13 can learn human language. And p-value has statistically proven that language cannot arise on its own. So we have valid proof scientifically that happened. We also have genealogical trees that prove that Genesis was
1 minute.
Sorry, was that it?
1 minute. Sorry, I was giving you a 1 minute warning.
All right. We also have these genealogical trees which show that, and from multiple places on Earth, that show that lineages go back to Noah, and 2 places on Earth where they can be traced through royal families all the way back to Adam. Matter of fact, the Chinese said the year was 2000, or the year 2000 was 4,700. They're dated back from the flood. The Assyrian calendar, the Saxons have a genealogy going back to Adam. The Danes and Norwegians both have a king's list that goes back to Noah. So these are lineage things that we can track to prove these things true. So what's the bottom line? Well, the Bible tells us, and genetics confirms, that we are all descendants from Adam and Eve. And all of the evidence proves that Adam were the first parents of all humanity. And they were created in the Middle East in the Fertile Crescent, and their skin was brown, not black, disproving the out of Africa theory. And God taught Adam language. We also have stated earlier that the haplogroups in biology, genetics, genealogies, and population growths of human and animal species all help prove the Genesis account.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. Now, let me reset my clock here. And so, Jordan, you are going to get 12 minutes, and you can start whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks, everybody. My name is Jordan. I'm a mechanical and nuclear engineer, and I am convinced that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, and all life evolved by natural selection. But just 10 years ago, I would have agreed with everything my interlocutors just said, because at that time, I myself was a young Earth creationist. One day, I was talking about my views with a coworker of mine, and he handed me a book that was called The Language of God by Dr. Francis Collins, a Christian geneticist. I was skeptical, but I read it anyway. Much to my surprise, the book contained answers to a lot of the objections I had, but more importantly, it armed me with better questions. Though I still wanted to believe in young Earth creationism, I made a decision after reading that book. I decided that the truth was important to me, and that if I was right, the evidence would confirm it, and if I was wrong, I wanted to know. After months of investigation, I found the evidence did not confirm my beliefs, so I did something that I think is beautiful. I changed my beliefs. I'd need a lot more time than I have to go over all of the evidence that I found, so I'm going to focus on the age of the Earth. The young Earth model, as I mentioned, gives it a few thousand years. But before I can do that, we have to talk about some physics. So I'm a nuclear engineer, so we're going to talk about nuclear physics. In a nuclear reactor, heat is generated by a process called nuclear fission, wherein a uranium atom absorbs a neutron and breaks down into two other atoms called fission fragments. You end up with very rare isotopes not found in nature. So if you see large quantities of them, you know that fission happened. It's the only way to get them. You might think of this as a fingerprint for fission. You need only one neutron to start fission, but you get 2 or 3 out of it, meaning you can have a chain reaction. But there's 2 caveats to that. One, the neutrons are moving very fast, and you need them to move slow. So you have to have a moderator, a material that the neutrons will bounce around in and slow down. That water will do that. The second catch is you have to have enriched uranium. In nature, uranium is 0.7% enriched. That means 0.7% of it is U-235. The rest of it is U-238. You need 3% enriched uranium to have that chain reaction. Now, that might have been confusing, but all you need to remember is water plus 3% uranium equals fission. So remember all that super rare stuff, the fragments that are the fingerprint for fission? You'd expect that to find that like the stuff that comes out of a nuclear reactor. You wouldn't expect to find it in the ground in a mine, but that is exactly what happened in Africa at a place called Oklo. In 1972, the uranium they pulled out of the ground was found to be not 0.7% enriched as expected, but instead as low as 0.3%. At first, they thought they'd lost some uranium, which would be a big deal because bombs. But upon further investigation at the mines, they found fission products, those fingerprints we talked about. And how could that possibly be? I mean, they had the water, that first part of the equation. The geology of Oklo led to water transporting uranium there. That's why there was a deposit there to mine in the first place. But what about the enrichment? Well, all uranium is slowly decaying away. U-235, the fissile stuff, decays much faster than U-238. That means 100 years from now, uranium that you find will be less enriched than it is now. But if you go backwards, the reverse is true. It becomes more enriched. How far back do you need to go in order to get that magic 3%? The answer to that is 1.7 billion years. So about 2 billion years ago, something amazing happened. You add water, and you had 3% enriched uranium at the same place at the same time, which gives you the coolest thing in the history of things, a naturally occurring nuclear reactor. No human involved, purely nature. It was actually predicted in 1956 by Paul Kuroda. Now, as cool as that is, the Oklo phenomena, it's a problem for the young Earth model because we know fission occurred. Even AIG doesn't dispute that. But getting the enrichment we know you need to have takes 2 billion years. Well, what if the uranium decayed faster in the past? That would fix it, right? Well, it turns out it's not so easy. See, if something decays faster, it's more radioactive by definition. So how much more radioactive would the uranium need to be to fit all that 2 billion years and 7,000 years? 34,530 times as radioactive. To put this in perspective, today you get a radiation dose of about 3.1 millisieverts a year. With the faster time required by the young Earth, that dose would become 3,200 millisieverts, an increase of 1,000 times. But wait, there's more, because that's what the dose is today. But if you go back in time to the 7,000 years when Adam and Eve were supposedly walking around, you'd have even more fissile material, which means more radiation. At that point, it would have been 147,000 times as radioactive, yielding an annual dose of about 13,500 millisieverts, 273 times the safe dose. Over their 900 years of life, Adam and Eve were probably very well acquainted with every possible form of cancer. But wait, there's more. Because to avoid this, some creationists have suggested that perhaps it all happened during the flood. Maybe that's what covered it all. Well, the flood lasted less than half a year. If you thought that compressing all of that decay into 7,000 years was bad, try compressing it into 150 days. That bumps the radioactivity up to 2.06 billion times as radioactive. Being exposed to that level of radiation for a single hour would be fatal several times over, and they'd be getting it all day, every day, for half a year. Clearly, compressing the timeline won't work. Oklo alone pushes the timeline back 1.7 billion years. So by now, I'm sure everyone listening is convinced, but I'm going to keep going anyway. So, radiometric dating. Some atoms or isotopes in nature are unstable because they have too many or too few neutrons. So these atoms will decay. They emit some particle and become something else, another atom, another isotope. The decayed atom is called the parent. The new one is called the daughter, not the son for whatever reason. The speed and type of decay depends on the particular isotope. The process is intrinsically random. You can't predict when a particular atom will decay, but when you have billions of atoms, you can make very accurate predictions about how fast they'll decay on average. Just like you can't predict a single roll of the dice, but you can very accurately predict what the average roll will be over 1 million rolls. Since we know how long it takes for a parent to decay, we can measure the ratio of parent to daughter and infer the age of the sample. It's a clock that occurs in nature. And that's the process we call radiometric dating. There are several different methods. Each has their own particular process, their own assumptions. Some constants are the half-life needs to be constant throughout the age. We already talked about that. That's definitely secure. The original ratio of parent to daughter needs to be inferred. That's made easier if the sample has been isolated over its whole life, but sometimes that can be overcome. I don't have a ton of time, so I'm just going to look at two methods, starting with uranium-lead. So lead-204 is non-radiogenic. That means it's not the result of radioactive decay. It comes with the world. So the amount of lead-204 you have tells you how much lead you had overall in the sample at the beginning. Lead-207 and 206, on the other hand, come from the decay of uranium-235 and 238, respectively. So in uranium-lead dating, geologists look at crystals called zircons. They measure the ratio of daughter lead to its parent uranium, and then you just solve for the age of the zircon. You even get a little bit of a self-check because there's two different decay paths. If the two ages agree, that gives you some confidence that the system was in isolation the whole time. It's very unlikely that those two would just agree randomly if you were just picking random numbers. Even if intrusions occurred, geologists have determined ways to get around that by examining multiple crystals in the area. The exact solution, the Concordia-Discordia intersections, is a bit complicated, and I can get into that if people want me to. But suffice it to say, it's a known problem with a known solution. This method has been used to date zircon crystals to millions and billions of years of age. One more type before we close this part out, potassium-argon. In another method, potassium-argon, potassium-40, which is a metal, decays into argon-40, which is a gas. When present in lava, that's where you find this stuff, the gas will leave because the lava is liquid. That's called outgassing. At the moment of cooling, when it becomes a crystal, the argon can't escape anymore, and then it'll start to build up. Measure how much argon-40 you have, and that tells you how long since the cooling happened. Now, there is a catch. There are some argon, floating about, being spewed out by the volcano or whatever, and some of it is captured, a little bit of it is captured when the crystallization happens. This is called inherited argon. This is especially the case if the lava was under a lot of pressure and the gas couldn't leave as easily. The effect of this then would make the crystal look older than what it really is. But it's flawed. But whatever gas there was at the beginning, what that would do is it would add a flat number of years to the effective age that you'd get from the dating. And in other words, it would give you a static amount of air. Well, how much air? Fortunately, we can empirically test that by going to lava flows whose age is known and seeing what age we get with this test. In 1969, McDougall et al. Found lava flows known to be less than 1,000 years old, and they had a potassium-argon age of 465,000 years. Now, that may seem super bad, but suppose that you had a sample that had 1 billion years worth of argon built up in it. That sample would have the same amount of argon when it was captured, that 465,000. So of the argon you saw, 465,000 years of it would be the air. But that means the rock is still 999.5 million years old. That's an error of 0.04%, which is pretty darn good. So how do we know these methods work? Well, as I mentioned, each method measures different isotopes with different decay mechanisms, and they measure them all differently. If the methods agree then, within margins of error, of course, then we know they're valid. One great example of that is in the Manson meteorite impact on the Pierre Shale, which created crystals when it struck the ground. The meteorite was dated with a variety of methods by no fewer than 8 labs. All of them gave the same date within margins of error of 74.1 million years. Another example, the Amitsoq Nisus in Greenland has been dated using rubidium-strontium dating, lead-lead dating, uranium-lead, and lutetium-hafnium. That's at least 4 different methods that I could find in some quick Googling by a variety of labs over decades. And all of those results from all of those different methods gave you an age of between 3.6 and 3.75 billion years. Over and over again, multiple methods by multiple people have yielded the same result. If the methods were bunk, we wouldn't expect this level of agreement. A variety of methods agree because the methods work. Now, that's not to say they're perfect. They have limitations and they have error. Not every method is applicable to every situation. That's just the way real life works. But at the very least, this has demonstrated the Earth is far older than what the creationists claim.
1 minute.
So my time is almost up, and I've barely scratched the surface. So there's there's the entire theory of evolution, not to mention all the flaws in the flood, et cetera, and I hope we'll get around to that. But I hope I've at least given you some of the reasons why I changed my mind. I just want to be clear, I am not a physicist. I am not a biologist. I'm not any kind of scientist. I'm just an engineer. So please check me. I'll be posting my sources afterwards. And if you see an objection raised by Ken Ham or Eric Hovind that points out some supposed flaw in modern scientific understanding, what I want you to do is not say, aha, that's ridiculous. How can they believe that? Instead, ask the question. That seems ridiculous. Is that really what they believe? And if so, why? What do they know that I don't? And then go find out what it is.
All right. Thank you very much. So we are now going to get into the 10-minute rebuttals. Has the affirmative decided who is going to start with the rebuttal or how you're going to break up the time?
Yep. So we got 10 minutes. I'll go the first 10 or the first 5. Give me a minute warning like you did before, Nick.
Sure.
This will be easier. Once I'm at 5, let me know, and Matt can take over the last 5.
Oh, well, so once, yeah, okay. I'll give you a minute warning, and then, yeah, sounds good. All right, whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Okay, so it looks like Jordan here just wants to attack a young Earth with assumption-based methods, but we're here using genetics. We're using straightforward mutation rates, and even the evolutionist, the uniformitarian, will use, for example, he's looking at radioactive dating, radioactive clocks. He's looking at the rocks, and he's trying to disprove a biblical base model. But when we actually look to genetics, traits, genes are inherited. And when we trace that back, we come right to a female ancestor, a male ancestor, 3 major haplogroups. We can see that genetics are going down. Genetic degeneration is exactly what we observe. So therefore, since we're defending Genesis and we are really utilizing genetics to prove flawlessly that science does support a literal interpretation of Genesis, we're going to have to discuss that in detail in the discussion. I will touch on his radioactive dating methods. Now, he did say at the end there, they do have limitations, they do have error, and this is a fact. Age isn't really measured. Rather, as he hinted at and he talked about here in his opening, certain processes and amounts of materials are measured, and then age is inferred. The fact that radiometric ages for rocks of known ages do turn out to be so seriously inaccurate is a strong suggestion that one or more of these assumptions is, of course, incorrect. He did talk about it in detail, and he is right. Secularists, uniformitarians, for example, they measure the amount of the radioactive parent and the daughter isotopes in the present. Here's the problem, and here's where the assumptions come into play, because they're making a whole host of unprovable naturalistic assumptions. Then they extrapolate backwards in time to make what is essentially a guess about an age. They assume uniformitarianism, the present is the key to the past. 2 Peter 3 says that in the last days there's going to be scoffers denying 3 things: the creation, the global flood, and the coming judgment. The fact that he rejects and scoffs at the global flood and then uses these radioisotope dating methods to prove his worldview and to prove his position speaks directly of 2 Peter 3. There is substantial evidence for a global flood. I mean, just to name a few, we find whole rock layer sequences deposited rapidly in quick succession. We see flat featureless boundaries. We see rapid or no erosion between sediment layers. How does he explain all this? Look at the walls of the Grand Canyon, for example. From the Tepites at the bottom to the Kaibab limestone at the top, it's supposed to be representing the 300 million years of slow and gradual sedimentary deposition that he talks about. But when the plateau was pushed up, those rock layers were bent and folded, but they were folded without fracturing. They had to be soft if they were bent without fracturing, of course. How does he explain this? And I did ask some questions to him regarding genetics, the 3 major haplogroups in my opening. So I hope he answers those in his rebuttal. But what all this means is that they could have only just been deposited. This means the 300 millions of years that he's trying to push never happened. All those rock layers had to be rapidly deposited in quick succession in the flood year. He talked about Francis Collins, the language of God, and how this changed his mind. Well, at the end of the day, Francis Collins and Biologos and the arguments used in this book have all been thoroughly debunked and addressed, of course. Some of the arguments that Francis Collins uses is his belief that humans and chimpanzees and other forms of life share genetic mistakes. I'd love to talk about this with Jordan in the discussion period, what he might know as pseudogenes. And at the end of the day, these pseudogenes, they now appear to be functional DNA elements and not mistakes. There's a scientist from Biologos who's associated with Francis Collins named Dr. Vanima. He likes to use the example and tell people that humans possess the broken remnants of an ancient chicken gene. And no such remnant actually exists. Instead, the fragment appears to be a functional DNA element. They'll go into the genetic identity, which Francis Collins, I believe, says is about 98 to 99%. But at the end of the day, new incoming data has revealed that the actual genetic identity is only 88%. That's 400 million DNA differences that exist between the two species. They'd love to talk about human chromosome number 2 as well. Francis Collins and those at Biologos. Is that 5 minutes? Okay, give me 30 seconds to finish my thought here. They like to push the human chromosome number 2, which they'll say, Francis Collins will say that occurred through the fusion of 2 ape-like chromosomes. That's been overturned. The purported fusion site is now actually known to be a functional DNA element in a human gene. Junk DNA era has been overturned. All the testable and future predictions are coming from creations. I want to say one last point on his radioactive clocks and radioactive dating, because he spent his entire 12 minutes on that. He definitely has a lot to address from myself and Matt's presentation. But if God instantly created trees, for example, and then we analyze this, the leaves would have chlorophyll, as leaves do today, of course. But it didn't come by normal processes. This is what Jordan doesn't understand. So when God made the first rocks, they had atoms in them. Let's talk about genetic. Let's talk about what's measurable, what's testable, what we can make predictions on, not the assumption-based method like he's using. If we come along later and say that lead must have come from decay of uranium, because he talked about this form of dating method, therefore we will use that to date the rock. You'd be wrong, of course, as there would be lead there to begin with. So why shouldn't there be? Therefore, let's stick to the genetics and how it proves a literal interpretation of Genesis. Go ahead, Matt.
All right, you got 3:40 left.
Okay. All right. Awesome. I don't know if you've seen our flood video, Jordan. I hope you did. That would have been fun. Okay. Well, all right. Regarding your opening then. I'm sure you stated it, that the newly expelled lava that comes from varying amounts of both parent and daughter isotopes, but the pre-existing daughter isotopes do not all boil out of lava before solidification of into igneous rock or indigenous rock occurs. So when testing like modern rocks, we know that those rocks formed from observation. We can see this from lava, right? But the daughter isotope percentages at formation vary widely and are in fact never zero. So if they're never zero, and if the daughter isotope levels at rocks formation in modern observed samples vary, then one must accept that the rocks from the past acted like that in the same manner. So if the starting ratios are not known, then there is no math that can find the date. The dates that are used and accepted by supporters of deep time are in fact nothing but guesses based off of this assumption. So this is why we really like biology, because you can observe the numbers in real time. You can look at mutation rates and trio studies and watch them occurring. And you can do this with these dating methods that you have, but they take such a long amount of time that they say, well, you can't actually test anything within 10,000 years for radioisotope dating, because it takes such a long amount of time. Right? I saw the roll of eyes. My bad. I shouldn't be watching you. Okay. Well, regardless, God made and created rocks that the earth is a part of. So think about it. If you were to test Adam the day he was born, how old would he have been? Standing for Truth said, if you were to test a tree that was in the garden, how old were they? But we know that trees take years to grow and years to bear fruit, but the tree was only 2 days old. So it wouldn't have actually been very accurate. We believe in special creation. So if the earth was molten volcanic rocks for eons, and we know that volcanic rocks that are tested have huge dating errors in them, and in fact, again, we would say that they never had zero isotopes. Thus, all accurate dating methods would be invalid. So one would have to rely on dating methods of rocks to disprove all the other data that was given. That's why you're just looking at one piece of a puzzle to refute everything else, when we need to kind of step back and look at everything and see how the puzzle fits it together and look at the overall picture. That's why we're kind of bringing everything to the table. So unfortunately, it was kind of a bombardment in the beginning. We kind of threw a lot at you. He probably gave you 5 or 6 or 8 different things. I gave you 5, maybe 6. So I know it's a lot. You gave us just rocks. So, I mean, I'm sure you'll want to touch on that more, but that's kind of why we trust that very much, because every time lava has been tested and those rocks that are formed from these lava, the dates are all over the place. And creationists love that too, because it's inaccurate. So sorry, Nick, was that?
No, you still got 30 seconds left, but Jordan ended 30 early too, so it's
okay. Then
works out if it works out.
Jump into discussion. That's fine.
All right, let's do the discussion. So,
don't
Jordan
I get 10 minutes?
Time. Don't worry, you're gonna get your rebuttal, Jordan. Don't worry.
So it's 30 minutes open discussion, and
no, Jordan still has his 10-minute rebuttal.
Oh Jesus, I'm so sorry. That was almost a problem. Yeah, Jordan, you don't really want to rebut. I mean, you know what? They were so good. Do you just want to call it a night and head home?
I think my argument was self-evident. So
okay, my sincerest apologies. You've got 10 minutes whenever you're ready.
All right. So like Matt said, they did throw a lot at me, so I'm going to just kind of go through it. First off, the question should not be, could God have done this? Because the answer to that's always going to be yes. I mean, he's God, he can do whatever he wants. But instead, the question is, what's the simplest explanation? Not meaning the one that takes the fewest words to say, but the one that has the fewest ad hoc assumptions, the one that makes the best sense of the data without stretching, etc. So just keep that in mind as we go on. They mentioned about information being on a downward decline, how it can't be generated by natural selection. New information can, in fact, be generated by mutations. It's not necessarily a downward spiral. Just one example of that would be a gene duplication and frame shift, where a gene or even a whole genome, if it's small enough, can be duplicated. So you have an extra set, and then you shift one of the bases. So the bases code a specific amino acid, which collectively make a protein. If you drop one of those letters, then every place from then on makes a different amino acid, which means a different protein. You have a protein that wasn't being made before, completely new genetic information, so you can definitely add information. And how could that be selected? Well, if it doesn't work very well, the thing that made it will die, and it won't make kids. So natural selection. Let's see. Was there a beginning? That is not necessarily a settled question. There was certainly a beginning to our observable universe at the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. However, it's not yet clear whether that was the absolute beginning. You've got the Carroll-Chen model. You've got several other cosmological models that work just fine with today's physics and have an eternal universe. So that's not a settled question. You may get into more physics hopefully later. But anyway, I'd need a citation for the languages arising on their own. There wasn't much there. So if we all came from Noah, I'd be interested how you deal with the genetic bottlenecking. You can see genetic bottlenecking whenever there's an extinction level event. That is cheetahs. Cheetahs are very genetically similar to each other, even if they're not related, like not brother, sister, cousin, that sort of thing. They're so genetically similar to each other that one cheetah can take a skin graft from another cheetah and it won't reject it. And that sounds like a good idea, and maybe it is if all you're worried about is skin grafts. But that leaves you very open to infection, to infant mortality, to all kinds of bad things. Genetic diversity is a good thing. Well, if that's how bad it gets when you have a small bottlenecking with one species. Why don't we see this kind of problem if we bottlenecked everything down to 2 individuals, or in the case of Noah, I forget, it's like 10 or 12 or whatever. But in any case, that would be a problem, something that you would observe that we don't observe. It's funny that they don't allow evolution to work over geological timescales, like over the billions of years that natural selection is supposed to have been working. But it's supposed to go super fast for the last 4,000 years. Like, which is it? Is evolution too slow, or is it fast enough? Like, you can't have it both ways. So they mentioned that I was attacking their model with assumption-based methods. Well, I'm attacking it with physics because physics is what I know. I'm a nuclear engineer, so that's just where my wheelhouse is. So let's get into that. Let's see. And also, physics is just better than biology, so there's another reason. So you asserted that dating methods are, quote, seriously inaccurate, but I think where that's coming from, and you'll have to tell me in the discussion, there are errors, and sometimes they sound really big. Like if you had, for instance, I saw an age earlier for a rock that was like 1.08 billion years, and it was plus or minus like 30 million years. 30 million years, you're not even close. Well, I mean, you're not that close compared to the billion years. Like, you have to get, there is error, but you have to compare it to the total age. So even though 30 million years might seem like a lot compared to a billion years, it's not that big a deal. You spent a little bit of time talking about there being zero of the daughter isotopes when it was created, or there never is zero. That's fine. There are certain methods like lead-lead dating where the initial chemical composition is just not even important, because the amount of lead-204, which is not radiogenic, that tells you how much lead was there originally. So you have the initial composition in terms of percentages. Sure, if some of the lead was carried away, that's also not a problem because isotopes are chemically identical. So anything that would carry one isotope away will carry all of the isotopes away. So that's why they deal with ratios and not total amounts usually. So yeah, that is not a problem. And for some things like the potassium argon, like I mentioned, you don't get a complete outgassing. The kind of naive freshman version of it is that they assume that there's zero daughter, but in actual fact, they know that there's not zero daughter. That's something they just have to account for, and it's part of the error. So that's part of why when you get to the bounds of detectability in a radiometric dating method, it gets less and less accurate. That's because of that error. So the argon that was trapped when it crystallized, all that would do is add some hundreds of thousands, heck, say millions. You can even say hundreds of millions. That's fine, because the age that they get is 4.5 billion years. So no matter how big the error you want to stretch it to, it's still way more than 7,000 years, which invalidates the model. There are some methods that can be dated within 10,000 years, carbon-14 being the biggest one. Argon, I think, can be done within a couple hundred years. The reason that you have these bands, it's not like one of the accusations I commonly hear is that, well, you decide what the age is ahead of time, and then you pick the model based on that, or pick the method based on that. That's just not the case. The reason that we say they have these bands of accuracy is because that's dependent on how fast or slow the genetic material or the radiometric material decays. So the reason that carbon-14 dating isn't any good after 50,000 years is just because there's no carbon left. It's not any kind of grand conspiracy. And that kind of brings me to, you're talking about being created with the appearance of age. When I was a creationist, that was my favorite thing. Well, it doesn't matter what the radiometric dating says, because God just made the earth look old. Adam was old when he was created, he made everything good, etc. That strikes me like you're saying God is a liar, which seems like a strange thing for a Christian to say. I already addressed the initial composition, so that's not a problem, which means in order to get the things that we see, it's not an assumption, it's not a guess, we are making inferences based on natural laws and predictable patterns, which is exactly the same thing you do in any other science, biology included. So in order for us to get what we observe today, if the universe is in fact 7, 6, 10,000 years old, it would mean that God would have to have created everything, to include the radiogenic isotopes, with the appearance that they had been there from the beginning. As if it had age, it would be completely indistinguishable from something that was 4.5 billion years. I mean, in that case, sure, but he could have also made it 10 minutes ago and given us all the memories that we have. It's a model that gets you nowhere. Yes, God could do that because he can do anything, but that isn't the simplest way to explain the evidence. See, I have 2.5 minutes left?
Yes, sir.
No erosion between the layers. I'm not sure why there'd be erosion marks between the layers. I'm not a geologist, so Maybe you can enlighten me on that. But if you accept the premise that these are being laid down, in most cases, not for every case, there's some layers of rock that are laid down quite fast, but for most layers of rock, it takes thousands or even millions of years. I'm not sure why you'd expect to see erosion marks between the layers. They would just be filled in gradually over time. How do you get that kind of bending without fracturing? Slowly and carefully, same way you bend anything without fracturing. So you only would expect to see fracturing if you tried to crack this huge rock layer really fast, like you'd get in the flood, I suppose, unless the flood also heats things up. I'm not sure what the point was there, but the fracturing isn't a problem for deep age, as you called it. Let's see. I don't know anything about the different genetic family types. I've never heard that before, so I guess I won't respond to that because I wouldn't have anything meaningful to say. Oh, the rib. So this one is a little weird too. It's a prediction, so to speak, of creationism, that they picked the only bone that can regenerate in mammals. Isn't that amazing? Well, what other bone were they supposed to pick? Like, was he gonna like rip off the guy's arm and make a life? Like rip off his like take a spine out like some guy in Mortal Kombat? I don't know what the other option was, like it's the only one there. And besides, who cares if it can regenerate? You've got God. He can just boom, there's your rib back. Like it's the fact that it can regenerate is a complete coincidence. It doesn't tell you anything. I'd rather just get to the discussion, so I'll just forfeit the rest of the time.
All right. Sounds good. So now, assuming I haven't like completely robbed anybody of their
but what about second breakfast?
What about second? Exactly. All right. So a 30-minute discussion. Is there anyone in particular who I assume the affirmative probably wants to begin the discussion? Is there anything you guys would like to start on?
Well, thanks for being so polite there, Nick. Yeah, I've got a couple questions to ask regarding what he talked about in his rebuttal, because he did bring up a couple new things and a couple points against our opening. So yeah, I could ask a couple questions.
All right. Well, then it's all yours.
Lay it on me.
Okay. I appreciate your opening and your rebuttal there, Jordan. I did want to comment. I got some stuff written down. Hopefully we can touch on it all. Obviously, you brought some more stuff up on the age of the Earth. You brought up duplications, frame shift mutations as a way to add new information, new novel information. But you did ask a specific question. You said, how do we deal with the bottleneck from our biblical-based position? Because so it looks like you at least understood our argument correctly in the fact that if we only started with two people, as Genesis would say that God created Adam and Eve, well, what does that do? Jordan, it restricts the diversity today. So from the biblical model, we all come from just two people. That's what we're defending here, right? Is science consistent with Genesis? That means that limited diversity is easy to explain. And the Bible predicted this. But you're talking about a bottleneck. Mm-hmm. For one, the evolutionary bottleneck hypothesis that you would have to resort to from a uniformitarian-based worldview, can you explain to me how that would be even remotely feasible and empirical? And then I can explain to you why ours is empirical and feasible. Go ahead.
Sure. You can look at Dating the Genetic Bottleneck of the African Cheetah by Minotti, Raymond, and O'Brien in 1993 from PNAS. You can look that up. That's a peer-reviewed paper that documents this phenomenon in cheetahs. You can observe the genetic bottlenecking by the genetic similarity between different cheetahs, the lack of diversity. That's what happens in a bottleneck. And the problems with that are documented in Genetic Basis for Species Vulnerability in the Cheetah, Science Volume 227 by O'Brien et al. So that's where the empirical data is. Basically, if you're asking me how it works, if you only have so many people, there's only so much genetic diversity, like you were saying, there's a limited diversity over short time scales. You could eventually create that diversity back up if you were given enough time, I suppose. I'm not a biologist, but over short time scales, it makes you undiverse. It's why inbreeding is a problem, and it's just that on a population level.
Right. So I appreciate that answer there. I am glad you brought up the cheetahs because I think there's, you seem to know a lot about it. I think there's approximately 10,000 or so cheetahs left. Mm-hmm. And conservationists, they're looking to keep them from going extinct, obviously due to this genetic bottleneck where I think there's the exposing of recessive mutations. I mean, we're seeing some pretty significant genetic damage in these cheetah populations. And that's why I believe that the evolutionary bottleneck hypothesis that you'd have to look to and that you're talking about here, I don't believe that it's feasible, because that, I would call it a rescue device. And why I would is because it would involve an extended near extinction event associated with severe inbreeding and severe genetic damage, just like we're seeing with the cheetah populations. Now, our position, and then obviously you can respond to that, but real quick, I want to answer your question. Based on the evolutionary perspective that you're holding to, and then the evolutionary worldview, the human genetic homogeneity, it remains a very serious theoretical problem. But with our perspective in the biblical base model, there's absolutely no problem. And I'll tell you why. Is because according to the biblical base model, we started with just 2 people, okay? And then 10 generations later, we have a second single generation bottleneck of what? Just 8 people. And this occurred at the time of Noah. Now, what's important here, Jordan, is that both bottlenecks were very brief, okay? For example, just 1 generation, and then explosive growth was followed by this. And in both cases, there would be almost no previously accumulated mutations, and therefore no inbreeding effects. But your explanation, the very limited genetic diversity we see, it still remains a huge problem, and I haven't seen you give an empirical answer. All I see is unrestrained storytelling. In the cheetah example that you gave, I don't think it helps your story. I think it helps us see that the story is not even remotely feasible. Go ahead.
I don't know why you'd need an extended bottlenecking event to get the problem. Once you restrict the population to a small amount, 2 would be way smaller than you need for the problem. But why is it that having a brother mate with a sister would be magically okay and wouldn't cause any kind of genetic issues if it happened 4,000 years ago?
Well, I'm saying your bottleneck would be prolonged. Our bottleneck is not prolonged. That's why the evolutionary bottleneck hypothesis, which involves an extended and lengthy near extinction event, right? You understand that it does involve a lengthy and extended near extinction event. That hypothesis is associated with severe inbreeding. That's why it's not even remotely feasible. It's not empirical, but the empirical data and scientific evidence supports our bottleneck of Adam and Eve, which was not prolonged. And also, there wouldn't have been any accumulated mutations. What do we inherit? 100 new mutations per person per generation. Take that back to a point of least genetic entropy, least genetic accumulation, Jordan. That would be a time of perfection, just as talked about and as we can read in Genesis. There's no inbreeding problem, but with you guys there is an inbreeding problem. So can you explain to us how to solve this very serious theoretical problem? Because you're going to have to address and critique our position. Go ahead.
There's no problem. I really don't understand what it is you're trying to get out. That yes, it is true that the bottleneck for the cheetah is an extended event, but that's just because that's how populations work in real life. That's just what would have actually happened here. I don't understand why that is mitigated if you just make it more severe. If you just make the problem more severe, I don't know why that mitigates it, but I think we're just kind of going round and round on that. I think that if you get down to 2 people, you're going to have some bottlenecking issues. You say you won't because, whatever.
Well, we have studies where things have gone into just 2s, but regarding the bottleneck, the supposed bottleneck that brought forth primitive man going in and modern day man coming out was supposedly 200,000 years ago, but there's no evidence in the geologic column for that event actually occurring. So that's a strange one. And then we have the deer that got let loose, for example. There were only 2 of them. They got let loose on New Zealand. Today, they're the most populated species that's there. They have to kill them just to get rid of them. Now they're more of a nuisance. They took 2 sheep and they put them on the Kruligan Islands, and within just 40 years, there were 700 of them. There was no problem with genetic diversity with these things. And these are only just 2 sheep where they know the numbers, and they diversify no problem whatsoever without any genetic problems whatsoever. So against what evolutionary theory says, you need a bottleneck of at least 25 to repopulate a land and everything. Well, we have multiple examples where that is now, and that hasn't been an issue whatsoever.
Do you have a citation for either of those events?
So go ahead.
Do you have a citation for either of those events?
Oh yeah, sure.
Just
yeah,
post it afterwards.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
I can't speak to it because I'm not a biologist and I haven't seen those studies. So, yeah, I don't have anything to say.
All right.
I don't want to speak outside of my expertise.
I don't want to jump in real quick. I'll let Matt finish his thought, but I just want to point out to the audience who's listening, the debate would be, is Genesis consistent with empirical scientific data? Now, in regards to Adam and Eve, which obviously we can read of in Genesis, God created two people. What do we see? Low genetic diversity among any two people on this planet. Somebody from Asia and me over here in North America, we're no more than 0.1% different. Therefore, that's what we would predict. Now, very limited human genetic diversity. It's as we can see here, because you don't have an answer to it. It's a huge problem for your position in evolutionary theory. I'm almost done. And it leads to unrestrained storytelling, as you're proving here. Now, at the end of the day, the evolution story as well, it still needs to be revised almost monthly, almost yearly, just to explain all this genetic related data. So the point is, limited, human genetic diversity, it's obviously compatible with the biblical perspective and a literal interpretation of Genesis, and that's the title of this debate. And it doesn't require any far-fetched mental invention. So why throw out a perfectly good Bible for a theory, like, for example, I wouldn't even call it a theory, like evolutionary theory, the idea that pine trees and whales are related through common ancestry, when there's no actual evidence for it? I mean, can you give us what's your best evidence for, I should ask you, do you believe that all life on Earth is related through common ancestry, right? Banana plants, pine trees, whales, dogs, are they all related according to your belief system? Go ahead.
You and a cabbage are a very distant cousin.
Right. So
well, there were a lot of questions there. Do we maybe want to give Jordan about 10 minutes because you guys took about 10 minutes worth of questions. So I'd like to give Jordan some time to answer a number of them here.
So, I'd like to ask them too, but let me try to rapid fire
and ask some. I think yes.
Yeah. So, the genetic diversity that we see across the planet, our species hasn't been around that long in terms of geological time. The species supposedly came about somewhere between 100 and 250,000 years, depending on which biologist you ask. So, the lack of genetic diversity fits that model. It's not a distinguishing factor. Something that is a distinguishing factor would be genetic diversity as a result of a point location from the flood. So since we're on the subject of genetic diversity, if Noah grabbed everything that was alive on the ark and landed at one point and then let everything go, that's what your model says, right? I just want to make sure I'm not mischaracterizing before.
Well, he probably didn't have to grab everything. He might have left some things behind, but yeah.
Okay, so the vast majority of things were on the ark. That's how it survived. And then he released them from a point. Why don't we see genetic diversity dropping off from that radiating point? And also, why do we see the grouping? So did the penguins, when they got off the ark, just troop along like soldiers all the way to the South Pole and no one thought that Australia was nice? What was the disciplinary effect that's caused these animals to group together after the flood?
What is that saying? Something of a feather flock together. We know that some things travel very good in groups. They like to stick together, kind of like humans do. We migrate together and we diversify in different races, and then we stick to our races and we don't like others. It's just kind of how animals and humans tend to be like. And then we see that, matter of fact, you can Google right now or type into YouTube, there's a penguin that travels over 5,000 miles every single year to go visit somebody who saved him over in Brazil. So they could easily have traveled thousands and thousands of miles to get to where they're at today, because a single one does it for fun to go visit a guy. So transportation is pretty easy. And after the flood, we expect that there would have been more land bridges. Things would have moved and dissipated a little easier, because we know that the ocean levels were rising even still to this day. So if they had land to walk on, it would have been much easier than they have today. And we still know that they can do it today. So that's fascinating. Sorry.
What did everything eat while they were walking? All the plants were under salt water for 40 days. And supposedly it laid down all these layers of rock, right? So what did the flood do? Did it pick up all the rock, hold the topsoil over there for a second, lay down all the rock, then gently lay the topsoil down on all the plants? I don't understand what they would have eaten during this 1,000-mile trek.
Good question. Actually, Darwin wanted to know that answer himself. And what he did is he took seeds and he submerged them in salt water for a very long time. And he actually found that they would sprout even after being submerged in salt water over a year. And the ark wasn't, for example, the ark itself, when it landed, they waited 3 months before they left the ark itself. So there's plenty of time for plants and things like that to actually grow for the animals to eat. Remember, a dove brought back a twig from an olive branch. So we know that there were months and months. Look at how fast an olive tree grows after 3 months. So are you going to say something?
Remember Carthage? Salted soil isn't great for plants to grow, and they'd have to grow pretty fast in order to fuel this 1,000-mile trek.
Well, we also have the fountains of the great deep that broke forth could have been fresh water that's underneath the ocean itself. And that's what flooded the earth, is the fountains of the great deep breaking forth. So like the icebergs that we have there today, that's fresh water. That's why they float. So the fresh water breaking forth is what formed and flooded the oceans. So it would have desalinated a lot of the oceans itself. So
which would have killed all the saltwater fish. I guess it sucks they didn't get a spot on the ark, huh?
That's their problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
so you mentioned something that I kind of addressed, but I'd like to talk about it with you specifically, Matt, because you talked about the appearance of age, which I said when I was a creationist, that was one of my favorite things. Sure. So why would God create things with every appearance, in other words, indistinguishable from something that was 4.5 billion years old, with the radiometric isotopes, them existing in a closed environment? In other words, there's no test that we could run that would disprove that. So why is it that God would? It seems kind of deceptive to me. So maybe you can break that down.
Okay, well, remember, there's a lot of dating methods. Only a few really show old. But the fact is that I don't know if it naturally. People generally just assume it's old. Remember, most people that believed even in science earlier on still thought young Earth creation. When you pick up 2 rocks on the ground, you can't look at one and go, that's definitely older than the one that's in my other hand. So it has to be done scientifically. You have to look at the isotopes. So what we're doing is when we're saying that, these different lava flows are giving different dates. When you go to the Grand Canyon, there's 2 different lava flows. The one that's multiple layers underneath the top layer shows massive discrepancies. The one that's on top shows that it's millions of years older, and yet even that dating is wrong, because they've actually recently found Indian pottery that from a tribe that lived there only 900 years ago, yet the lava flows 300 million years old. So the dating methods we think are debunked because we constantly find the falsification and multiple errors that come from these things. We don't think that God's trying to trick us by throwing these numbers around. We just think that what's happening is that these isotopes are they formed during during the flood at this really rare occurrence. And
well, then how do you explain the fact that at that point it'd be Noah, that Noah and his family survived radioactive dosing that would have been thousands of times greater than standing next to the reactor at Chernobyl?
No problem. When you're because when you are standing there on the ark, these radioactive isotopes are forming in things like granite that are underneath the ocean from these tectonic plates and compression. And guess what? Even today, you can stand next to nuclear reactors that are under the ocean, literally 30 feet down, and the people are standing there without suits on because water protects you. Water
is an effective shield for alpha and beta rays. It's okay for gamma, but that doesn't protect you against the radioactive isotopes that are inside you right now, inside the food you eat, inside the wood of the ark, inside the animals, inside everything. And if everything is speeding up to what was the number? I did the calculations earlier today. If it was 2 billion times as radioactive as it is today, how do they protect themselves from the potassium-40 that was in their bloodstream? What shielding did they have there?
Well, remember, we don't believe that they had these things before the flood. So these things would have been in the elements themselves after the flood.
So potassium-40 didn't exist before the flood, except it did because it was in the rocks. But
remember, these certain rocks formed during that process. It was massive tectonic shifting. The continents moved from dramatic shifting very quickly. And
so there were no radioactive isotopes before the flood, just to be clear.
Right. Correct.
So radioactivity did not exist before the flood.
Right.
And then during the flood, radioactivity existed, but only under the ground, not in all the other places where these radioactive isotopes would be. I just want to be clear.
Well, no, they started forming in the ground during the tectonic shifting, during the compression, during that rare event when things were starting to compress. It's called the catastrophic plate tectonics. And that's why I was like, that's why I asked you in the beginning if you had seen our video, because it would have really helped. But that's our fault for not giving it to you.
So how did the potassium? I'm sorry. How did you eat potassium whenever you eat a banana? The banana did not go down miles under the earth to get the potassium-40 from the granite, which is where you're saying it came from. How did the banana get the potassium-40?
Because at the end of the flood, during the formation of all the mountains, these things arose, and they finally had these new elements in the soil which weren't there before. So now they're just in the earth. They're like granite. You can tell us today, but it's not as damaging, right? So granite doesn't give it out enough. If you had a granite countertop, it wouldn't affect you.
So it would have, you could detect it with a Geiger counter, but it's not dangerous anyway.
Right.
No.
But bananas are much higher. Matter of fact, if you were to go through a machine, you would actually, it would go off. Your bananas would go off because of how much potassium, radioactive potassium there actually would be in that.
XKCD has sorry, this is an aside, but XKCD has an awesome chart that shows radioactivity in banana doses. So you can see like how much a reactor would be in bananas.
No good.
Yeah. I don't know. We can move on to a different topic. I don't want to dominate, but that seems like special pleading. You're saying, well, radioactivity didn't exist. Then it existed only where we'd be shielded under model, but not anywhere else where we observe it. And then afterwards, it just spewed everywhere. I guess that seems like you're really contorting in order to avoid the physics. I don't know how much more time we have left.
We are on about, I think we're on about 10 minutes. Hold on, sorry. We're on 11 minutes, and then we're going to do some super chats and stuff like that.
You took 10.
I want to jump in real quick because I think Matt's explanations are more than sufficient. I think your problem is the fact that you're rejecting a global flood to begin with, but I think you're underestimating the scope and scale of the energy produced by the flood, and the fact that when the fountains of the Great Deep are broken open, Jordan, and if you can imagine it, the Earth is fractured like an eggshell, right? The continents are moving vertically, they're moving horizontally. The tsunamis, they're driving flood waters onto the continents. The continents are moving at rapid paces through the flood waters. And I wanted to ask you about this before we move on to a couple of other things you talked about. We do have a testable prediction that was confirmed. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. Matt did touch on it. The model is called catastrophic plate tectonics. And in this model, based on the fountains of the Great Deep breaking open, Jordan, the pre-flood ocean crust, it's dragged down, okay? It's dragged down into the mantle core. As you would know, that's called subduction process. Now, here's where the prediction came into play by Dr. John Baumgartner years and years ago, that the cold ocean crust, okay, according to this hypothesis, should still be cold since this occurred only thousands of years ago, even though, according to this model, it has descended into the deep hot mantle. We have seismic data from NASA. It has revealed, after the prediction was made, enormous slabs of cool rock under North America itself, but down in the core, it should still be warm. Now, this is confirmation of flood geology, just showing you that it's not just all ad hoc. So not only genetics, do we have future testable predictions? I noticed that you didn't have any explanation for the testable predictions on the three major haplogroups, and that's fine. But there's also testable predictions to be made on flood geology. That's why Matt's explanations there flow from a hypothesis that's derived from Genesis, which actually has consistent and inaccurate predictions. So how do you explain all that, and why would you deny that to begin with? Go take as much time as you need.
I need to see the thermodynamic calculations in order to talk like how cold the slab would be. Without the calculations in front of me, I can't really say. I will say that a large heat transfer is dependent on surface area. The larger surface area thing you have, the more heat transfer you're going to have. But I'd have to see the calculations to know whether or not it'd be feasible. If I
can definitely.
Let's give Jordan a bit more time, because I think you guys have had about 20 to 40% more time than him. So I'd like to.
So talking about testable predictions, though, it seems like you're picking the predictions that fit your model, but ignoring all of the rest of the predictions, because the model makes predictions, a lot of them, not just the ones you're picking. So, for example, you've got predictions about how canyons will be formed, right? Like the Grand Canyon, you say the flood creates the Grand Canyon. Is that correct? Yes.
With that, the flood would
flood created things like the Grand Canyon that came from the flood.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in that case, the prediction you'd have is that we would see a shape in the Grand Canyon similar to we see it like Mount St. Helens, for example, or when dams burst. You've got a lot of inertia. This water has a lot of kinetic energy. And what kinetic energy and inertia doesn't like to do is change directions. That's basic physics. And so when you've got the Grand Canyon, instead of a straight blasted line like you'd expect from this massive flood, that would be the prediction, you instead get this winding river. So the flood would have had to come in screaming hot and then make a turn and then go screaming hot again and then make a U-turn. So why is it we see these kind of weird winding things, which is what you'd get from a plane that was being raised and then weathered down, but not what one would expect from a catastrophic flood?
Well, I would okay. So first off, you mentioned Mount St. Helens. Yes, we would say Grand Canyon was formed from the flood, probably after the flood, whether it was weeks after the flood. But what have we learned from the eruption at Mount St. Helens, which is actually an observable event? Okay, and it's also a small scale event compared to the worldwide event of Noah's flood, of course, where the Grand Canyon would have been formed then. Obviously, we didn't see it. This is a thing of the past. But Mount St. Helens did demonstrate that sedimentary layers, which are hundreds of feet thick, I believe it is, could be laid down in hours to days, that canyons can be formed rapidly, and how multiple fossilized forests could form as the result of a single volcanic eruption.
That didn't answer the question.
Well, my question would be, the Grand Canyon is a thing of the past, but we can look at something observed like Mount St. Helens and see that these canyons can be formed rapidly versus the uniformitarian explanation for something like the Grand Canyon.
You still haven't answered the question. The question was, why do we see the shape of the Grand Canyon that we do when we know what happens when you have high inertia, massive catastrophic events, and that is not the shape we see? There's a prediction of what the shape of the Grand Canyon would be. Observations do not match that. Why?
Well, I would have to say that take the Grand Canyon. It's like a rift. It's like something opened up, right? It fractured. We don't know if it was a pull apart or when the continents hit and ruptured this area open. But what it is water always finds the lowest point. So we know that if it was carved, we would find millions of metric tons of rock from that being carved away downstream at some delta. But those rocks aren't anywhere. So they must have been removed during the receding waters of the flood. So whether or not the water was helping form the canyon later from something, sure, no problem. But there's no way that it could have formed that entire thing based on that, because we would find the evidence of those rocks slowly corroding that canyon away, right?
Yeah, I mean, it would be carried away, but there are geological processes that can deal with the missing Grand Canyon and whatnot. So basically what I'm hearing is that there's no answer for the curving thing.
Well, no, I think an answer was given, and I think, unfortunately, your basic assumption of uniformitarian processes is hindering you from understanding the explanation. But as Nick said, we do have limited time here. I do want to jump into
one more thing, just to even up the time real quick. You mentioned the catastrophic flood creating the radioactive isotopes. Is that something that God simply, spoke or whatever and made it happen? Or is that a physical process that you're saying the flood did it?
Physical process.
Okay, what is that physical process? Sorry, I didn't mean to jump on you. Go ahead.
No, of the radioactive elements being formed.
Yes.
I believe that they formed from the types of rock that were underneath the surface, from the pressure that was happening. See, what happened is we believe that the moon was going around and pulling and tugging on the surface of the waters and all of the mantle. And what happened is the water that was under the crust of the earth couldn't take this anymore. So it broke. And when it broke, the pressure from that water forced everything down. And during this forcing down, massive amounts of pressure was building up and creating these new elements to form. Very hot water creating new elements to form. And they do this to this day. They actually form new elements from this process. You
think that the pressure of the water was enough to spark nuclear fusion?
Right.
That's ridiculous.
I don't think it's ridiculous. I think in 2 Peter 3, when it says that the scoffers in the last day are willingly ignorant, I've given you testable, confirmed predictions based on the flood model. I do want to ask you, though, because you did talk about how The Language of God by Francis Collins convinced you that evolutionary theory is true.
Well, one point. It's not that that's convinced me. It started me on the road. I can see where you got that. That's not.
Okay.
It was a start. Go ahead. Continue.
No problem. I appreciate that. You mentioned natural selection acting upon, random variation, random mutations. You said mutations could add new information. But what we know about mutations, Jordan, is that they're overwhelmingly corrupt. They cause corruption, loss of biological information. And the fact that these low impact deleterious mutations are accumulating in our genome and degenerating our information systems, do you have a type of selection that would be able to stop that degeneration in order to take your fish to fishermen to begin with?
I would dispute the basic premise that the mutations are accumulating at a deleterious rate, so a rate that would be impossible for selection to adjust to.
Do you know approximately what the human mutation rate is currently, according to scientific consensus?
Not off the top of my head, no.
So it is roughly 60 to 100. Some even say 130 to 150 new mutations per person per generation. So that would indicate, Jordan, that mutations are entering the human population at a rate much faster than natural selection could ever possibly select away such mutations. As you know, neutral mutations, for example, they're not acted upon by natural selection because they're invisible to natural selection. So these mutations that build up, how does natural selection remove them would be my question.
If they're neutral, there's no need to remove them.
How much of the genome would you say is functional on a percentage wise?
I'm not a biologist. I couldn't give a percentage.
Well, incoming data is suggesting that the trajectory is favoring genome-wide functionality. Therefore, these neutral mutations that you say are completely neutral, they're better referred to as nearly neutral. That means there's a tiny fitness effect. The best way I could make you understand it, Jordan, is that we have a genome, right, of 3 billion letters. So if you take out one letter or change one letter randomly, are you going to have a huge fitness effect? No, just like you said, the neutral mutations, they don't have a huge fitness effect. But it is going to have a tiny fitness effect. That's the problem. And it's like rust on a car, Jordan. You can't see each rust event, but it's continuous and destructive. Here's the problem. If you don't have an explanation or a resolution to that mutation accumulation problem, you're never going to be able to take your fish to fishermen, and you're never going to be able to convince us empirically that pine trees and whales are related through common ancestry. So do you have an answer for this problem of genomic degeneration?
You're assuming that mutations are only one direction. You're assuming that no mutation could ever be reversed by the same process by which it was expanded. So the math is going to be far more complex than you get 100 per, you multiply out by generations, boom, you get your number. That's just not how nature works. It's not that neat. You'd have to read a biology textbook. I'm not a biologist, so I can't specifically say what mechanisms there are. That's not my field of expertise. But what I will say is that the picture is not as simple as the simplistic one you're drawing.
All right, and I'm actually going to call the time right there because that is in fact our time. So thank you all very much. I would like to read some super chats before we go into the closing. So if you guys want to think about what your closings are going to be, and we will cover the super chats. A number of them came in. We've got half of them, I think, came in from Sifredo Zarabia, which I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly, and I'm sure there's going to be some significant correction on that one. But so let me do at least one or two, and then we'll move on. So the first one is: an airplane a kind of bike or hierarchies? I assume that that's for standing for the pro side. While I'm not entirely, I'll let you guys determine how to answer that. But I'll ask another one from Maynard Saves. Standing for truth, can you explain the anomalies with the octopus?
I think the octopus defies evolutionary theory. I don't know what he means by anomalies, but you can read through those as quickly as you want if you want to get through them.
All right.
Octopus has genes nothing else has. That's why.
I'll read them, and if there's one that somebody finds particularly interesting and they want to engage on, we can do that. Digital demonic Davros ex-Catholic here. DNA is not in the Bible. All right. Standing for truth. If you take Genesis literally, this is Cygart. If you $5. If you take Genesis really literally, then where is the age of the earth mentioned? Do you consider interpretation of genealogies to be, quote, literal?
Well, there's plenty of places in the Bible. For one, it talks about a creation of the heavens and the earth in 6 days. You can see the genealogy. You can actually calculate, even if there are some gaps, it's no more than 6,300 years. I mean, I could read through the whole Bible. I can go through passage after passage that talks about that gives at least hint to the age of the earth. And the problem with the uniformitarians is they reject a global flood. So therefore, they have to conclude that the earth is is old. But I don't think anyone, for the most part, is going to dispute that the Bible talks about a worldwide flood. And 2 Peter 3, right from the Bible, tells us that the scoffers in the last day will deny this global flood. So the Bible speaks almost on every page of a young earth, a young creation. And the Bible does make very specific predictions on genetics on that super chat prior to this one. And that's why we've made predictions regarding Y chromosome Adam, mitochondrial Eve, 3 major haplogroups, low genetic diversity. And that's the topic of this debate. So thanks.
All right, thank you. And then we have same person at Jordan. What percentage of uranium-235 is found naturally? Without human intervention, can fusion occur naturally? Why doesn't it always happen? Any evidence? And does spontaneous fusion happen in nature? Those were 2 super chats.
Okay, so the natural abundance of uranium-235 is 0.7%, and some other numbers. It's very uniform across the world. So 0.7% is the enrichment today. The other one was, can fusion happen naturally? Fusion happens in the sun. That's a fusion reactor. So all you need for fusion is enough energy to overcome the Coulombic barrier, which is the repulsion between like charges. So it's very powerful, but you have to have enough to overcome it. Then the strong nuclear force can bind the nuclei together. In the sun, that happens because you have such a gravitational pressure that overcomes the Coulombic barrier. By humans, we have we try to use lasers to heat things up to give enough energy. Basically, you need a ton of energy to get fusion to happen. Does it happen spontaneously? Not outside of a star, but it does happen. Well, okay. There's always going to be limited numbers. I'm speaking in generalities. In large numbers, it only happens in a star. Spontaneous fission happens all the time in uranium. But I think, did that answer all the questions?
I think that answered everything that, yes, in that cluster there. We also have another one for $10 from Zafredo Zarabia again. I am extraordinarily dyslexic, and I think this person knows me and is very angry with me and is just deliberately.
I think you're doing great, Nick.
Nobody else could do better.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm not sure I believe that, but thank you. Oh boy. At Nick. So now I get one. Is it philosophically sound to believe on atheism that between 1 and 2 seconds there's an infinite amount of time, like 1.9998, yet this stream will I don't know why you're so giddy. It wasn't for you. Yet the stream will end. And Jordan says we're not here 10 minutes ago with natural evidence. So it looks like you were kind of tagged in on that one. That in my mind gets into Zeno's, in particular, I think Zeno's stadium paradox. Zeno had, if I recall, 12 paradoxes. Most were motion, but you can same problem with time. And I think that's Zeno's stadium paradox. And someone actually came up with an answer to that, I think, not too long ago, but it's beyond me. But yes, it gets into whether time is infinitely divisible or not, but the human mind starts to have considerable difficulties answering questions like that. But just because we can't answer them easily in our own heads doesn't mean that A, mathematically there isn't an answer, and B, this gets into Zeno again. Time may well be infinitely divisible. Even if it is, just because we can't comprehend that doesn't mean that time is not flowing and moving forward. But you get into relativity versus quantum mechanics, and it gets confusing. How long for a special? Okay, now those are our audience questions. I think we did have at least one more. Once again from Sifredo Zarabia. How long for a kind to speciate in the biblical model? I think that's for you guys, the affirmative.
I don't want to take up too much time, but I did cover that briefly in my opening regarding the created heterozygosity hypothesis, that God created the original kinds with pre-existing functional DNA differences, which does make specific predictions on DNA function. And these predictions are coming true more and more every day, as well as very specific predictions on speciation rates, which actually directly addresses his question. There is a paper out recently. Dr. Nathaniel Jensen has an article out on Answers in Genesis regarding it. I'd look it up, but new species have been observed in finches just recently in observed time. Obviously, regarding the model, immediately post-creation, speciation events would happen rapidly, because just through processes like recombination, gene conversion, new combinations of traits are going to arise quickly. So immediately post-creation and post-flood, speciation events would be quick. Exact numbers and calculations and the technical details, I would suggest reading the article and the paper that's associated with it regarding the new species of finch that have arisen, which has actually been a confirmed prediction based on the created heterozygosity hypothesis. So lots of interesting stuff coming out from young Earth creation scientists currently.
All right, here was an interesting one that he then asks, for both creationists, if your God came to you and revealed that the creation story was man-made and evolution was indeed factual, would you believe him?
Oh, yeah.
Standing for truth?
Oh, I left that one for Matt to answer. Did you want to ask it again?
Well, it said for both creationists. So
okay. Can you ask it again, brother?
Sure. If your God came to you and revealed that the creation story was man-made and evolution is indeed factual, would you believe him?
If you well, I'd have to conclude whether or not I'm hallucinating or dreaming. If God Himself revealed it, He's revealed the truth in His Word, and there's no indication that man and ape or man and pine trees are related through common ancestry. So God already told us evolution is not true, and the science tells us it's not true as well. Thanks for the question. Good question.
And I do apologize. I'm going through most of these. We're now into the questions from the audience, and I think I'm going to do a couple more, but it looks like most of them are for the affirmative. I apologize, Jordan. You could just the mic just suddenly mutes. He's like, I'm.
If that's the case, Nick, should we jump into our conclusions and then get as many questions in after as we can? I mean, if you did chat, it's up to you. You're the moderator.
Yeah, let me do another question or two, and then I think we'll probably move on.
Can we get more nuclear engineering questions? That would be awesome.
If we could, most of these are on genetic entropy. So emotionally stunted emoticon asked, if genetic entropy is ubiquitous, can they explain or can they give examples of wild species within the phylum Arthropoda that suffers the effects of accumulating deleterious mutations?
Well, good question from ESE there. ESE and I have had 3 or 4 debates where we talk a lot about this specific topic. In regards to his question on genetic entropy, I mean, we have examples of genetic entropy in all walks of life. I mean, we have it in bacteria, viruses, human beings. He's asking for wildlife examples, which we have provided him those before, I think, in polar bears, and Raw Matt has a few more examples in regards to that. His specific one was what?
Arthropoda.
Arthropoda. Yep. For one, which example did we give him before there, Matt? And then what would be...
Well, I mean, that most of those species they're dead. They're mostly in the fossil record, you know. So he's probably just thinking about like what maybe some bugs or insects or anything with an exoskeleton, basically. So he wants insects. So yeah, they've tested insects as well on mutation rates. So it's kind of broad spectrum, but they also have found that the mutation rate is quite fast. I'll get you the numbers in a second. Hold on. Mutation rate. Sorry. I've answered this before, so
Pressure's
I
on.
haven't memorized all of them, but I'm close.
All right. I knew you had the citations from when the previous debate with ESE there. So I thought instead of
we have a new question. So if time is finite, how long will it take for Raw Matt to look up a citation during a live debate?
So
we have that from anonymous person in the live chat.
Nick,
right.
you tricky moderator.
I think I may have thrown my lack of bias out the window on that one, I guess.
All right, the
Very
study is
neutral.
called
We
Exceptionally
appreciate
High
it.
and Diverse Mutation Rates in Insects' Small RNA. I will post the link for all of them to see.
That's what it is. Yeah, we wanted an exact answer. But what's funny about emotionally there is he's asked for many examples. We've given him more than enough in bacteria. Like I could go on and on about the evidence for genetic entropy. It's very important to the two worldviews, because that's what creation would predict: death, degeneration, extinction of a once perfect creation and genome. So Jordan didn't really have any answer during the discussion portion, and I think that's very important to understanding Genesis and the whole story of the Bible as a whole.
All right, and we actually just got in one more. It was a $10 super chat, so I think we'll hit this one, and then we'll move on to the closings. New super chat, chat cold. Okay, Jordan, what is your favorite equation that you use on a regular basis? P.S. Good job rebutting the creationist.
Well, sadly, when you actually get to do engineering, the computer does most of the equation crunching. So, but when I was finishing out my undergrad, my senior design project was designing a nuclear reactor for an MPDT thruster to go to Mars. And my favorite equation there was the vector equation that would solve the optimal flight path to go to Saturn or Jupiter, or wherever you wanted. And that's my favorite one because it took me a month, because I am not a physicist, but I was trying to read a physics paper, and they go straight from step A to step Z and don't tell you anything else. So that's my favorite equation.
All right. So what I think we will do now, we actually hadn't discussed the order for the closing. I normally go in the reverse order, but it's up to you. So since we had started with the affirmative, I would start with the dissent, if that works for both of you.
Sure. I don't have
All right. So 8 minutes, Jordan, whenever you're ready.
Get my personal timer so I can check myself.
I do apologize. There are a few. I know there are some. There's a good number of questions, and some of them really quite good that we did not get to, and they're bringing that up in the live chat. I'm going to need to get going. I do apologize. So this is, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you all very much. So let's whenever you're ready.
So, at the close of this, I think I've given some good reasons to think. Certainly not all the reasons there could possibly be. That would take way more time than we've got here, even if we sat here all night. But a lot of reasons to think why the Earth is far, far older than the few thousand years cited by young Earth creationists. I focus mainly on the physics because that's my area of expertise. Excuse me. And I'll be posting my sources after the debate, so you can check me, because I'm not a physicist, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a chemist. I am a layman in these subjects. So it's very important not to take what you're given at face value. You need to do the research. Real quickly, to summarize what I talked about, naturally occurring reactor at Oklo is one of the coolest things I've ever heard of, and also clearly demonstrates that we would need at least 2 billion years for the Earth, for that to happen. Without that, in order to compress the phenomena that even creationist sites like AIG and creation.com don't dispute, you'd have to have radiation levels that would be orders of magnitude above what you could safely handle. Talk about mutations, you'd be growing third arms if that were the case. Radiometric dating, despite what my interlocutors said, the initial values are not a problem for many types of radiometric dating, and scientists work very hard to overcome that. I'll post a textbook that you can read if you really want to go to sleep real fast tonight. But basically, unless God has decided to do a grand deception on a massive scale, that's not an issue. That's the only explanation. But rather than just relitigating all of the evidence that I heard, I think the time would be better spent just talking more generally about evidence and truth. First, I used to be a creationist, so I feel like that gives me a little bit of empathy for people who stand on the other side, because I used to be standing there too. And I'd like to encourage anyone who believes in a young Earth because they think it's the only way to read the word of God they were given. That's very important to them. I understand. Look around. Billions of Christians have fulfilled spiritual lives connected with the Lord while believing that God chose to create the universe 13.8 billion years ago. And in some ways, I think that that's even more dramatic. I mean, sure, it's cool for him to wave it in existence in 6 days and rest on the seventh after ripping some ribs out. But isn't it so much cooler if he set it up 14 billion years ago, created this grand machine and then set it into motion, perfectly timed and orchestrated so that humans would evolve at exactly the right time for his plan. Now, I don't think that's what happened, but I just say that to show that you shouldn't feel, it can often feel like you're under attack or like someone's trying to take your faith away. But here, I'm not trying to take anyone's faith away. You know, it doesn't matter to me what you believe. I'm just interested in the truth. And so I don't think anyone should see this as a threat to their faith. Believing that Genesis should be taken metaphorically shouldn't threaten anyone's soul. Jesus himself taught in parables all the time. So I don't see any intrinsic reason why Genesis couldn't be taken the same way. So the question then shouldn't be about whether or not you can trust God's word. It should be whether you can examine the universe around you and make inferences using the mind that God granted you in order to determine why we see what we see. Either you think that the universe is predictable, it was made by a God who had order and wanted his people to be able to explore it, or you think that it was created by someone who laid traps for you to fall into, things like radiometric dating and things like that, to deceive you. I think that one of those isn't compatible, and there's plenty of room for interpretation there. So what should you do with everything you heard? For me, the answer is simple because the truth matters. I want to hold as many true beliefs as possible and as few false beliefs as possible. And if you're taking the time to listen to this debate, you probably value truth too. So what you should do is don't take my word for it. Don't take Matt's word for it. Don't take SFT's word for it. Follow the evidence. Go find out what these predictions are. Dig down into the details. A lot of things sound very good at the surface, but if you dig down into it, a great example was the source of radioactive materials. They say that the pressure is enough to create it, but I can tell you as a nuclear engineer, that is not the case. It is not as much enough pressure to overcome the Coulombic barrier.
So I do apologize to everybody. It looks like we did get disconnected somehow. We are now reconnected. It looks, however, we are reconnected into a second stream. So I will allow James, who has been lectured time and time and time and time again on having separate keys so that if you get disconnected, you can reconnect, and we will turn this into a let's everyone make fun of James. So I would like everyone to just take 10 seconds to pause and think about how we're going to blame James for this. We are reconnected, and so now I think you lost the last 30 seconds before I interrupted you to tell you that I thought we were disconnected. So do you want to go from 30 seconds back, and you still have about 3 minutes?
All right. I'll just have to guess where in my eloquent speech I was. All right. So why should anything that you just heard matter? Well, for me, that answer is very simple. It's because the truth matters. I want to hold as many true beliefs as possible and as few false beliefs as possible. And if you, like me, value that, and I bet you do because you sat here for an hour and a half to listen to us all talk about the truth. If you value truth, then what you need to do is put in the work. Don't believe what I say. Don't believe what Matt says. Don't believe what Standing for Truth says. You need to do the investigations, and you really need to dig into the details. There are a lot of things that sound plausible on the face of it. For example, from the debate, we heard the source of all radioactive materials was the flood, the agitation of the waters. Things are under a lot of pressure. That would be enough for fusion, right? And if you never looked any further than that, you might walk away thinking, oh, sure, a lot of heat, a lot of pressure, fusion. As a nuclear engineer, I am telling you that is not the case. That the amount of pressure you'd need would literally have to be, it would be cosmic in order for that to work. So they're going to need a better mechanism, but you wouldn't know that unless you looked into it. So when you are confronted with something that sounds ridiculous, some kind of claim from evolution or physics or whatever, it sounds ridiculous. Rather than saying, well, that's ridiculous, how could they believe that? Say, that sounds ridiculous to me. Why do people who've spent decades researching think this? Maybe it's because they know more than you do, and maybe there's something that clears it up. Maybe not. but you won't know until you ask. So thanks a lot for having me here. I've really enjoyed it, and hopefully I can come on again. Oh, and Reason to Doubt with a 2, because there's 2 of us. And that's it.
All right. Thank you. Now, gentlemen, do you want to give me some idea of how you want to break up your 8 minutes there?
Sure. I'll go probably for 4 or 5 minutes. Once I'm done, Matt can take over if that's okay with you, Matt. Is that what we planned?
Yeah, no problem. Go ahead.
Okay, so I guess I'll start now. I want to address as quickly as I can all the stuff that might have been left unanswered. He did say he gave lots of reasons, but what he believes. But what's funny is he spent his entire time using and utilizing radioactive dating, radioactive clocks. He obviously came to debate the age of the Earth, but he gave no real rebuttal to our entire opening, nor any of the genetic related evidence that we use to prove Genesis. So he's going to have to address those. Well, the debate's over. He didn't really address them to actually, I guess, show why he became in the position he is when he used to be I believe he said he was a young Earth creationist before, which is funny because he doesn't know or give any hint of knowing anything about the low genetic diversity, the 3 major haplogroups, and the testable predictions that flow from that mitochondrial DNA map. I definitely urge him to look into it because creation scientists are the ones making the predictions. I could go into it all in detail, but for sake of time, go watch my debate with Adam Friended where I do touch on those predictions, of course. So he does need to answer the mutation accumulation problem, of course. It really is. This extremely high mutation rate is a profound problem for what he believes in and what he wants to promote. He denied the fact that they would have a tiny effect on fitness. But the problem is that these neutral mutations, it is a fact that they're invisible to the natural selection process. And that just means that these accumulating harmful mutations, they are continuously building up in the genome and rusting out the genome. He's going to have to answer that. His objections, his arguments regarding radioactive dating was answered sufficiently. They were answered extensively. And since that was his only argument, he doesn't really have much left to stand on. And he denies the global flood, even though we've given plenty of evidence for its occurrence, including testable predictions. I talked about how one of the predictions of the catastrophic plate tectonics model is that if the plates are being pushed down, they haven't had time to melt. And this new field of science that I referred him to as in seismic tomography, they have learned that massive cold slabs of rock are at the base of the mantle. And that means they haven't been pushed down there long ago, as the uniformitarian would want you to believe. They've been pushed down there recently. They haven't melted yet. This is huge confirmation of the global flood model and more specifically the model of CPT. So he's going to have to address that as well. Junk DNA, the created heterozygosity hypothesis, we have specific predictions on DNA function. What we know, especially in regards to ENCODE and how they found that at least 80% of the non-coding DNA was transcribed into RNA, suggesting function. The trajectory of discovery does favor genome-wide functionality. Therefore, his argument about completely neutral mutations falls flat on its face. The non-coding DNA that they look to as evolutionary leftovers junk that would make a mutation completely neutral, we now know it's involved in regulatory functions, embryonic development, the timings of protein manufacture. I can go on all day on the functions that have been discovered in those areas. This is a very serious problem that he needs to answer if he wants us to believe that universal common ancestry is true. How much time am I at there?
I think you're at almost 4 even. Let me double check here.
Okay.
Yeah, 4:13. So yeah.
413. I do want to address one more time the fact that his radioisotope dating that is used to date these igneous rocks, they do involve and require many unprovable and unknowable assumptions. And he did admit to its limitations, its errors. And if he does deny all the evidence for a worldwide flood that we have presented, then of course he has to continue holding to that position of uniformitarianism. And just a few of the assumptions that he relies on is whether the initial conditions of the rock samples are accurately known, whether or not the amounts of the parent or daughter elements in a sample have been altered by processes other than radioactive decay. Matt answered it in the discussion as well very thoroughly. So, like I said, he didn't really give any reasons, and his rebuttals were very limited, unfortunately. So the topic of the debate is, does Genesis and science, do they correlate? Are they consistent? And of course they are on many reasons. Matt, you can take over.
3 minutes.
Okay. Oh, awesome. Well, I want to say sorry, Jordan, because I didn't really know that you really wanted to talk specifically on radiometric, like elements and decay and creation of those elements. I even watched your radio show to figure out like what are your favorite topics, so I could came more prepared. But I didn't hear you bring that up and mention any of those. So I would have had some links, something to give to you, something to present. I gave one on the side chat there for you. But they've been making new radioactive elements in Japan using supercritical heated water. So I can give you some links to those. Unfortunately, to really get into some of the things like that God taught Adam language would have taken too much time for this debate. But these are fascinating things because they literally destroy the secular understanding of these things that are always taken for like, oh, well, man must have grunted language into existence. And it's such a fascinating study when you read all these stochastic models that show that there is no possible way that anybody over the age of 13 can learn language because they don't have language acquisitions. It's amazing. So I just wanted to end with this was awesome. I had a great time. Unfortunately, debates kind of go so quickly when you're in them. When you're watching, they can be slow, but this went so quick. And now that I know Jordan and I know what he likes to debate about, maybe we can even do this again, man. I liked it. I tried to answer every question you gave to me, so that was good. You were throwing out a lot, so that was good. Just try to think about some of our openings, about secular science does tell us that we came out of Africa and those were black people. And then, well, the Bible says that that's not true, that we were in the Fertile Crescent. And the haplogroups that he was describing are all indicative to what we see in reality. The odds of that happening, the statistical odds of all these things lining up with what Genesis says are incredibly hard to just say that that's impossible, that it's okay. That's just coincidence. So when we look at coincidences,
1 minute.
We look at that and sorry, what?
1 minute. Sorry.
Okay. When we do look at coincidences, that is science. That's what p-value is. P-value is. It's the statistical hypothesis testing of what probability value is. So when I was trying to say to Aaron Raw, look at the odds of this, he just didn't want to hear it. He said, so what are they? So what? What are the odds I woke up this morning and put on my socks? I'm like, I don't know what that means. So it's odds, you know what I mean? I wanted to show that the odds of all these things lining up from a 5,000-year-old book that sheep herders wrote is pretty astronomically high. So that's all, man. I just want to say that.
Thank you very much for bringing up the image of Aaron Ra putting on his socks. That's really what I think we needed to end this debate with. I appreciate it, Matt. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thanks.
All right. Now, in all seriousness, thank you all very much for being here. Jordan, thank you very much for coming. Raw Matt, Standing for Truth, thank you guys very much for this debate. I'd also like to thank Praise I Am. Oh, hold on 1 second. You ended a little early there. Praise I Am that I am. I think that's correct. For doing the back end, he was doing the back end, so that really freed me up to mod, which I really appreciate. Thank you also to James for having me, and thank you all for.
For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
Looks like I think your problem is the fact that you're rejecting a global flood to begin with. What we know about mutations, Jordan, is that they're overwhelmingly corrupt. They cause corruption, loss of biological information, and the fact that these low impact deleterious mutations are accumulating in our genome and degenerating our information systems, do you have a type of selection that would be able to stop that degeneration in order to take your fish to fishermen to begin with?
I would dispute the basic premise that the mutations are accumulating at a deleterious rate, so a rate that would be impossible for selection to adjust to.
Do you know approximately what the human mutation rate is currently, according to scientific consensus?
Not off the top of my head, no. Well, I'm attacking it with physics because physics is what I know. I am not a physicist. I am not a biologist. Well, I'm attacking it with physics because physics is what I know. I am not a physicist. No erosion between the layers. I'm not sure why there'd be erosion marks between the layers. I'm not a geologist, so I don't know anything about the different genetic family types. I've never heard that before, so I'm not a biologist.
Can you explain to me how that would be even remotely feasible?
If you were given enough time, I suppose. I'm not a biologist, but
the empirical data and scientific evidence supports our bottleneck of Adam and Eve.
I can't speak to it because I'm not a biologist and I haven't seen those studies. So, yeah, I don't have anything to say.
All right.
I don't want to speak outside of my expertise.
How much of the genome would you say is functional on a percentage wise?
I'm not a biologist.
Do you have an answer for this problem of genomic degeneration?
You'd have to read a biology textbook. I'm not a biologist, so I can't. So at the close of this, I think I've given a lot of reasons to think why the Earth is far, far older than the few thousand years cited by young Earth creationists.
He did say he gave lots of reasons, but what he believes. But what's funny is he spent his entire time using and utilizing radioactive dating, radioactive clocks. He obviously came to debate the age of the Earth, but he gave no real rebuttal to our entire opening, nor any of the genetic related evidence that we use to prove Genesis.
I don't want to speak outside of my expertise. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a chemist. I am a layman in these subjects. I'm not a biologist. I am not a physicist. I'm not a biologist, but I'm not a geologist. I can't speak to it because I'm not a biologist. I'm not a chemist. I am not a physicist. I am not a biologist. I'm not a biologist, but I'm not a biologist. I'm not a physicist. I am not a biologist.
I should ask you, do you believe that all life on Earth is related through common ancestry?
Follow the evidence. I'm just interested in the truth. You and a cabbage are a very distant cousin. How did the banana get the potassium 40?
Because at the end of the flood, during the formation of all the mountains, these things arose and they finally had these new elements in the soil which weren't there before. So now they're just in the earth.
We can move on to a different topic. I don't want to dominate, but that seems like special pleading. You're saying, well, radioactivity didn't exist. Then it existed only where we'd be shielded under model, but not anywhere else where we observe it. And then afterwards, it just spewed everywhere. I guess that seems like you're really contorting in order to avoid the physics.
The theory of chemical evolution claims that the Big Bang occurred 13 to 14 billion years ago. Conditions were so severe that this initial event only produced the lightest three elements of the 94 found in nature: hydrogen, helium, and lithium. Chemical evolution theory maintains that the remaining elements were cooked in stars and ultimately produced and spread throughout the universe when the stars ran out of fuel and exploded as supernova. It is assumed that our solar system, including the Earth and all the radioactive elements found on Earth, gravitationally accreted from the debris of this explosion. Heat generated by the many impacts of this accretion supposedly resulted in a molten Earth for approximately 200 million years. After 200 million years, the accretion ceased, so the liquid Earth cooled and heat was radiated into space, forming a crust. The radioactive parent elements trapped in and on the Earth then decayed into daughter elements we find today. Today, the ratio of the number of parent to daughter atoms is measured. The decay half-life is then factored in to arrive at a radiometric date for any given rock sample on Earth. This assumption about the past is the foundational rationale for old Earth theories. Many leading evolutionists assert confidently that the Earth and everything in it came about from stars exploding. Some realize, though, that all the physics has not been worked out to back this claim up. Another problem with this idea is that much evidence collected from similar nearby rocky planets like Venus and Mars suggests that they have very cold cores and or show little radioactive decay. This is odd, assuming that all the planets formed from the same stardust. Earth's core is hot, while its crust contains much radioactivity. Conditions on Earth are very different. Here's why. The binding energy is what holds an atom's nucleus and all of its positively charged protons together. The binding energy per nucleon, that is, either a proton or neutron, changes depending on how many protons and neutrons the chemical element has. Here we see a chart of the average binding energy per nucleon for each element. The elements are shown on the x-axis by the number of nucleons they have, and the y-axis shows the average binding energy per nucleon for a given element. Light elements are on the left and heavier elements are on the right. Notice there is a peak in this data at around 60 nucleons. The binding energy per nucleon is as high as it can be, and anything heavier sees a drop in the energy holding nucleons together. The evolutionary explanation might work for nuclei with less than 60 nucleons, but this is because fusion events for light elements result in increased binding energy. For example, if two deuterium nuclei fuse into one helium-4 nucleus, you can see that the binding energy per nucleon increases, meaning the new helium nucleus is held together more securely than the two deuterium nuclei. If the data kept climbing up and to the right, all would be well for a chemical evolution theory. As you can see, this is not the case for elements heavier than 60 nucleons. Trying to merge any of these heavy nuclei in the chaos of a supernova will always result in less binding energy. They will break up or fission. The larger the nucleus, the greater this tendency, as there is less and less binding energy holding it together. This is the data that causes chemical evolutionists to look to physicists and hope that they will eventually figure out why cosmological theory doesn't match observation. And this is why the United States National Research Council, in the year 2000, listed the following as one of the 11 greatest unanswered questions in physics. How were the heavy chemical elements from iron to uranium made? Textbooks and teachers rarely explain this problem. Where is Earth's radioactivity located? Looking first at an evolutionary model and following well-established laws of heat transfer, we'd conclude that after billions of years of radioactive decay and assumed mantle crust circulation or convection, that the heat produced should be uniformly distributed throughout the Earth's crust and mantle. This idea, however, is not supported by the data. Measurements all over the world show striking differences in the distribution of heat. While radioactivity produces heat, it is not safe to assume that lots of heat means radioactivity is the source. For example, ocean floors are releasing a great deal of heat, however little radioactivity exists there. In startling contrast, Earth's continents are releasing slightly less heat than ocean floors, yet we find 70 times more radioactivity concentrated on our continents. In addition, the radioactive heating on the continents is spotty and not uniform. Interestingly, the ratio of deuterium, or heavy hydrogen, to normal hydrogen in Earth's oceans is only half that found in comets. Deuterium is created when hydrogen atoms in water molecules are bombarded by neutrons. If the Earth's water came from comets, why do our oceans have only half the deuterium concentration as comets? What produced the deuterium, and why is there a difference in these ratios? Many believe that nuclear reactions are occurring deep inside of Earth's core, and that the heat released by these reactions is the cause of geothermal heat. Measurements taken in the world's deepest drill holes show that temperatures rise very rapidly with depth. If deep radioactivity from Earth's core is the source of this heat, then the temperature increase with depth would mean that everything below 50 miles would be melted. However, seismic data from thousands of earthquakes show conclusively that the mantle rock is solid down to about 1,800 miles. Karlsruhe and Jaeger reveal that while the distribution of radioactive elements in Earth is unknown, the radioactivity must be very shallow, not deep, and confined to Earth's thin granite crust. This means the radioactivity is concentrated in the primarily granitic continental materials. So the answer to this first question, Earth's radioactivity is not uniformly distributed throughout Earth, as is expected if Earth evolved. Instead, we see that radioactive elements are concentrated in Earth's granite continental crust. The hydroplate theory will explain why. We now must answer a second question in order to see how heavy elements were created. What conditions or forces could overcome the Coulomb force? Two possibilities exist. They are the Z-pinch and shock collapse. Returning to the bolt of lightning, let's discuss what it is. Atmospheric lightning is a plasma. A plasma occurs upon electrical breakdown of any substance. In this case, the air molecules, mostly nitrogen and oxygen, have been transformed from their normal gaseous state to plasma. This happens as the electrical potential, or voltage, between the clouds and the ground increases above air's dielectric strength. The result is a massive flow of electrons, a current that arcs between the clouds and the ground. After a lightning strike, showers of gamma rays and a burst of neutrons are detected, a result of nuclear reactions and radioactive elements produced by the lightning. So what is happening within the plasma? When electrical current travels through close, parallel wires, a very powerful pinching force is generated known as a Z-pinch. Lightning struck this tube, causing it to be radially compressed or pinched together. The higher the voltage and the closer the wires, the stronger the pinch. In lightning, at electrical breakdown of air, the plasma produced as electrons are stripped from air's nitrogen and oxygen molecules act like closely spaced wires carrying a tremendous flow or current of electrons. So the stripped electrons follow paths that resemble the flow of electrons in closely spaced wires, but the spacing is at a minuscule atomic scale. Remember, the closer the spacing of the wires, the stronger the pinching force. Since the atom's outer electrons are stripped away, positively charged nuclei, rather than flying apart, are powerfully pinched together. The pinch is so strong that it overcomes the Coulomb force, and the strong nuclear force snaps the nuclei together, forming heavy, unstable, radioactive nuclei with short half-lives between 10 and 100 minutes. Of course, all this occurs in an instant, producing the light that we see as a bolt, and intense heat that expands the surrounding air, producing a sonic crack of thunder. This effect is similar to the research that Germany's Dr. Fritz Bosch has demonstrated. An intense electrical field will strip electrons from the surrounding heavy nuclei. Atoms become unstable and throw themselves apart, sometimes changing their decay half-life a billionfold. The term Z-pinch is used because those first studying this phenomena were using the familiar XYZ Cartesian coordinate system in their analysis, and the compressive pinching force was occurring about the Z-axis. Had they set up the force along a different axis, we might be talking about the X or the Y pinch. This is not science fiction or theory. Researchers at Sandia National Laboratories have built this Z-pinch machine and are taking advantage of this powerful force to produce nuclear fusion in an effort to produce a controlled nuclear fusion reactor. Nuclear power plants today are fission reactors. If successful, a fusion reactor would be able to produce great amounts of cheap, clean electrical energy. The Ukraine's Electrodynamics Proton 21 laboratory has also been revealing the tremendous power of the electrical Z-pinch. While stars can only produce the first 26 or so elements, researchers are finding that a focused Z-pinch can produce the entire periodic table of elements and far beyond. Researchers at this laboratory using the Z-pinch can squeeze together a target of pure common nuclei like gold, silver, or lead into previously unknown super-heavy elements, many twice as heavy as uranium or lead. These super-heavy elements, because they are so large, are unstable and quickly decay back into the more stable 94 natural elements. The process involves passing a beam of electrons traveling near the speed of light into a target electrode of extremely pure metal to produce a focused Z-pinch, which implodes the target's nuclei into a tiny point. Because the point is so small, temperatures in the hot dot reach a staggering 630 million degrees Fahrenheit. The imploding nuclei within the hot dot merge into unstable super-heavy nuclei. The dot then explodes, producing a flash of light, gamma rays, X-rays, and many nuclei fragments of all sizes that repack into the more stable 94 or so, quote, naturally occurring elements and isotopes, plus some super heavy elements that last for several months before decaying. Incidentally, the stable elements that are produced and are heavier than 60 nucleons end up absorbing the excess heat. Thus, the hydroplate theory solves the problem that has perplexed others. How could the Earth have withstood the heat released by so much accelerated decay? The answer is the heat was absorbed in fusing heavy elements such as uranium. This has been demonstrated in the Proton 21 laboratory. Dr. Adabenko calls it cold packing. So far, 22 different metals have been used for electrodes. All produce similar results. After subjection to the Z-pinch, a portion of the pure material is transformed into lesser amounts of all the naturally occurring elements. Why does this happen? Why do these super heavy elements decay and fragment into the 94 naturally occurring, relatively stable elements, including heavy, slightly unstable radioactive elements that are concentrated in Earth's primarily granite continents? To understand, we need to see what drives instability. Here we see the periodic table with elements color-coded according to their instability. As has been discussed, the larger the nucleus, the greater its potential instability. But this instability is not only due to size but also to the ratio of the atom's protons to neutrons. For most light elements that are stable, this ratio of protons to neutrons is high at around 1, close to 50% protons, 50% neutrons. For very heavy elements to remain somewhat stable, this proton to neutron ratio drops to around 0.67, or roughly 40% protons to 60% neutrons. Remember this difference between these two groups of elements. Now consider what happens when a Z-pinch of many small light nuclei produces a large superheavy nucleus. Since the large nucleus has been made up of merged lighter nuclei whose proton to neutron ratios are 50-50, the new superheavy nucleus will retain the same 50-50 ratio, and therefore it is extremely unstable. When all the elements and their many isotopes are plotted according to their proton to neutron ratios, and then given an instability rating, the pictured chart is produced. What we see is that if you have too many protons or too many neutrons, the nucleus is extremely unstable, shown here as 100% unstable, and will immediately break up or decay. Stable elements that we are familiar with are located down in what is termed the valley of stability. Notice that the valley curves to the right, between points A and C. The 50-50 proton to neutron ratio line is shown between points A and B. Viewed from directly above, we can now see the bottom of the valley of stability. We see that uranium-238 is somewhat stable with a half-life of 4.5 billion years, and it plots on one of the sidewalls of the valley. Uranium-238 eventually decays into lead-206, which is stable at the very bottom of the valley. One of the decay products, while uranium-238 decays toward lead-206, is polonium-218. It is very unstable, and we see that it plots along the high rim of the neutron-heavy plateau of instability. Polonium-218 has a half-life of only 3 minutes. Here is the 50-50 ratio line again. Remember, lighter elements have proton-to-neutron ratios near the 50-50 line. If Z-pinched together, these light elements form heavier elements with the same 50-50 ratio. They lie high on the proton-heavy side of the plateau of instability, and quickly fission into many smaller fragments, some of which are still radioactive and unstable, like uranium, polonium, etc. We now can see why many question the validity of assuming that uranium-238 to lead-206 and all other parent-daughter decay ratios represent the age of a rock sample. If powerful electrical currents that were once a consequence of a global flood produced radioactive elements, then many mysteries of Earth's radioactivity are explained. Radiometric dates are meaningless. For evolutionary theory, the alleged mountain of data in support of great uniformitarian epochs of time really adds up to nothing more than a very precise set of ratios, not dates. Of course, pressurizing the waters below created the equal and opposite reaction of pushing up on the granite plates. In some places within the continental plates, it appears that this pressure was too much for the plate to structurally support. Many large inland seas appear as deep craters. Hydroplate theory ties these features again to the unique conditions seen during the Genesis flood. Some spots of the granite plates generated more nuclear energy than the surrounding area. If too much heat were generated in this local area, then the pressure from the expanding supercritical water below could lead to catastrophic rupture of the plate. Here's another view. The newly exposed chamber floor rose up until it reached hydrostatic equilibrium and became the basin of an inland sea. The floors of these inland seas usually have thick mineral layers of salt. These mineral layers are the remnants of the granite minerals dissolved by supercritical water of the Great Deep and later precipitated by a process called outsalting that occurs in supercritical water. This was occurring decades before the Genesis flood. Because of the many neutrons absorbed by the supercritical water, we now find high concentrations of the isotope oxygen-18 in these deposits that blanket the Gulf of Mexico and the Mediterranean Sea. Finally, we can now see why comets are found to contain about 2 times more deuterium than Earth's oceans. The volume of the Great Deep was about half the volume of today's oceans. A relatively small amount of water was launched and escaped Earth's gravitation. This water remains deuterium-rich in space. Some of the launched water radiated any remaining heat into space and fell back as constant rain for 40 days according to Genesis. Most of the remaining subterranean water continued to well up from under the plates for another 110 days after the constant rains had ceased. These deuterium-rich waters mixed with the pre-flood seas, which cut the concentration of deuterium in half, and this is why we measure diluted concentrations of deuterium in our oceans today and concentrated deuterium levels in comets.
So it begins.
Get ready to buckle your seatbelts and hold on tight, because on December 10th, worlds are about to collide. You've seen his podcast, you've seen him debate creationists before. He is a nuclear engineer, and he's out to debunk the flood of Noah. Jordan, from Reasons to Doubt, takes on the man, the myth, the legend himself, Dr. Ken Hovind. Hovind has over 200 debates against some of the world's greatest evolutionist apologists. He's certainly no stranger to debates. Ken versus Jordan, the debate of the year, the global flood of Genesis. Be there. Mark your calendars, hosted by SFT. Be there.
We are giving you one final warning. This Wednesday, Dr. Ken Hovind takes on Jordan from Reasons to Doubt podcast. Jordan is a nuclear engineer and he is ready to defend uniformitarianism. And of course, Dr. Ken Hovind himself is ready to defend the Genesis flood. This debate will be one to remember. Be there.
Mark your calendars, hosted by SFT. Be there.
It's all yours, SFT.
Awesome. Thanks so much there, Praise. We are live tonight on Standing for Truth, and we've got a really, really exciting one for you tonight. As a matter of fact, it's Dr. Ken Hovind's 200th debate, so we're going to make sure that this is one to remember. This much anticipated debate is most certainly, as I said, going to be one to remember. We've got Dr. Ken Hovind defending the Genesis flood and Jordan here defending uniformitarianism. So before we get started with introductions, I'd like to thank both these men for giving us their time, because without them, debates like this would not be possible. So before I have my co-moderator here, Nephilim Free, go over the format and structure for the debate, I'd like to first start with brief introductions from both the debaters. We can start with Ken Hovind and then move on to Jordan. So if you guys would like to just give a brief explanation as to who you are and what you may be doing with your channels or ministries. So go ahead. We can start with you, Dr. Hovind.
Well, thank you for having me. My name's Ken Hovind. I taught high school science and math 15 years. I've been a Baptist preacher for 45 years. And I take the position the Bible is literally true and scientifically accurate, just like it's written. Jesus said the creation of Adam was the beginning, and I believe he was absolutely right, and that can be proven scientifically. I believe the flood in the days of Noah happened exactly like the Bible says, covered the whole world for about a year, and that explains all the fossils and every canyons and everything else we find. So I defend the position the Bible is true, and the evolution theory is ridiculously stupid. All right?
I appreciate that introduction, Dr. Hovind. Let's move on to Jordan. Go ahead.
I'm Jordan Karam. I am a mechanical and nuclear engineer. In my off time, I run a podcast with my buddy Jared, who's a former theologian. We're both atheists now. It's called Reason to Doubt, the number 2, because there are 2 of us. And we just talk about skepticism, how to examine evidence. We go over everything from alien abductions to anti-vaxxers, and with a mixture of science and profanity. So check us out, and really glad to be here. Glad you guys invited me.
Well, I appreciate that introduction from you as well, Jordan. We're happy to have you both, gentlemen. So let's get this party started. I'm going to hand it over to my co-moderator here, Nephilim Free. He's going to go over the format and structure of the debate, and we'll go from there. Go ahead, Neph.
Okay, so welcome everybody. This is going to be fun. We have a 1-hour debate, 10-minute openings, and 6-minute rebuttals, and then a 20-minute discussion period, and a short Q&A, and that's how it's going to roll. Now, Jordan has elected to go first, and so Jordan will take the floor first. He'll have 10 minutes for an opening statement, and we'll go ahead and just get started. So, Jordan, my clock is set. When you begin speaking, I'll start the timer, and we'll get this ball rolling.
Let me just get my screen set up here. Oops.
So just to recap, 10-minute opening statements, 6-minute rebuttals, 20-minute discussion, short closing, then Q&A.
All right, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Phenomenal. All right. Again, my name is Jordan, and I used to be a young Earth creationist. I grew up learning from Dr. Hovind and others like him, and I was absolutely convinced that his interpretation of Genesis was correct. Eventually, I escaped my echo chamber, and I was confronted with evidence that changed my mind. I now agree with virtually every expert in every relevant field. I am convinced that the geological and fossil record took millions of years to get to the condition that we see them in today, through consistent but not constant processes. Investigating claims about the past is not unlike being a detective. You come up with a model that explains the evidence and use it to make predictions that are either confirmed or not. If those predictions are confirmed, your model is more likely to be correct. Just as a detective can figure out who probably committed a murder, even if he didn't see it himself, we can figure out what probably happened in the past, even if we didn't see it. So today, I'm going to be looking at 3 pieces of evidence: radiometric dating, specific geological formations, and fossil sorting. I'll compare the predictions of my model versus the Hovind model, and we'll see which one holds up. So let's start with radiometric dating. Some elements in nature will decay, becoming a different isotope or element. The original isotope is called the parent, and the new isotope is called the daughter. Since we know how long it takes for the parent to decay, we can measure the ratio of parent to daughter and infer how long that amount of decay would have taken to happen. This process is called radiometric dating. The prediction of my model is that we should see evidence of advanced age in these ratios. In uranium-lead dating, geologists look at zircons, which are uranium-rich crystals. There are 2 isotopes of uranium that decay into 2 different isotopes of lead. This means that you have 2 independent measurements of age, 1 for each isotope. That gives you a nice self-check. If these ages agree, that's very unlikely to have happened randomly. But what if lead was in the crystal originally? Well, fortunately, there is an isotope of lead, lead-204, that doesn't come from radioactive decay. So it must have been there when the zircon was formed. By comparing the ratio of lead-204 to the other isotopes of lead in the whole rock, you can infer the initial conditions of the zircon. Because of this verification and built-in double check, this method is considered one of the most reliable by the scientific community. The prediction of my model is that these ratios would indicate ages in the millions of years, and of course that's precisely what we see. Now, creationists at the RATE project have attempted to save their model by arguing that half-lives were much shorter in the past, and that all requisite decay happened during the flood. But you don't get to just change the half-life without consequences. Decreasing half-life increases radioactivity. Though the water from the flood may shield Noah and his family from some sources of radiation, the human body contains radioactive isotopes such as potassium-40 and carbon-14. The dose from those isotopes alone would be 117,000 millisieverts every hour, the equivalent of 20 nuclear bombs. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I don't think Noah's going to pull through that. And that's before you consider the heat from this radioactivity, which, according to creationists at the Institute for Creation Research, would have raised the surface temperature of the Earth to roughly 22,000 degrees Celsius. That's 3 times hotter than the sun. So that's one disconfirmed prediction for the flood. Next, let's go to geological formations. Despite what you may have heard, no geologist has ever said that every kind of rock takes millions of years to deposit. Some can accumulate quite quickly, like after a volcano erupts, but the uniformitarian model would predict that others would in fact take a long time. So one example of that, underneath the Mediterranean Sea, there are vast deposits of salt 800 meters or more thick, with a total volume of more than 1 million cubic kilometers. These are huge deposits. They're comprised of several different types of salt, dolomite, gypsum, anhydrite, and halite, which paint a picture of varying conditions over time because the different types of salt require different conditions to form. This event, the event that formed all this, is called the Messinian salinity crisis. Geologists have written extensively on this topic for 40 years, but here's the broad strokes of what they think happened. The Strait of Gibraltar closed at some point 5.5 million years ago, so the Mediterranean stopped getting water from the Atlantic and began to evaporate. Shallow areas dried up completely, leaving large salt pans, while deep waters became progressively more brackish and salt precipitated onto the sea floor. This process was not linear, and regions of erosion can be seen where salts were washed away, followed by more accumulation on top. Depositing such vast quantities of salt with varying local conditions would take hundreds of thousands of years. They can't be explained using the flood model, at least I don't think so. But it matches perfectly with uniformitarian predictions. So that's 2 predictions down. Lastly, the order of the fossil record. So according to flood geology, fossils are the remains of creatures that were trapped in one single catastrophic flood event. To explain the apparent sorting of fossils, i.e. dinosaurs at the lower rocks, mammals at higher rocks, the methods proposed are hydraulic sorting, original location, and differential mobility stroke intelligence. This is great stuff for making specific predictions to test by, so let's start with that, beginning with hydraulic sorting. In fluids, denser objects fall faster, and larger objects fall slower due to greater drag. The flood prediction of hydraulic sorting is that creatures of roughly the same density will be sorted with larger specimens on top and smaller ones at the bottom. To test this, we can look at the ammonites. They were a cephalopod similar to the modern-day nautilus. They had coiled shells ranging in sizes from as small as a thumbnail to 2.5 meters across. The shells also had an internal gas chamber that varied in complexity across species. So if it were hydraulically sorted, we would expect them to be sorted roughly by size. That prediction sadly doesn't match up with reality. What we actually see are small to medium ammonites all throughout the layers from the lowest to the highest. And in the highest layers, we have fossils that range from 10 millimeters to 4 feet. Now, this is not what hydraulic sorting predicts, but the ammonites are sorted by complexity. Ammonites with a simpler internal structure are found at the lowest layers, while those with a complex internal structure are found at the highest layers and never the other way around. This sorting regime matches perfectly with the uniformitarian model, where more complex structures didn't evolve until later. Next, original location. Often Dr. Hovind will plat his fossil clam, which is a type of bivalve, and say that we generally find those at the bottom of the fossil record because they're already at the bottom of the sea when the flood happens, and so they'd be buried first, which makes sense. But bivalve fossils exist up and down the fossil record in every layer of sediment from the Devonian on up. And I have all the sources for that there at the bottom of the slide. Once again, this doesn't match the predictions of the flood model, but it's what we'd expect to see with uniformitarianism, where the layers represent deep time. And so bivalves existed throughout that time, so they exist throughout the layers. Incidentally, that doesn't fit hydraulic sorting either. The last mechanism is differential mobility stroke intelligence. According to Dr. Hovind, birds would be on top of the fossil record because they could fly above the water, but this doesn't make sense given the rest of our fossil record. For instance, pteranodons can fly. Why did they all choose to lay down and die with their dinosaur brethren instead of flying with the birds? We don't see angiosperms, which are flowering plants, until much higher layers of rock. Did all the magnolia trees gallop across the plains and outrun all of those animals? Did all the other angiosperms that currently grow in marshes and by rivers, did they collectively decide to sprout elsewhere? It doesn't seem to make much sense to me, but in a uniformitarian view, it makes a lot of sense. So let's put all of these three mechanisms together and look at the common mole. The mole seems pretty much doomed on every count. They're small and relatively streamlined, so they'd be hydraulically sorted lower. They aren't particularly fast or intelligent, so they wouldn't be able to run to high ground, and their habitat's about as low as you can get. They're already underground. All three flood predictions would put these creatures low on the fossil record. Yet the first mole fossils don't appear until the Eocene, which is one of the highest layers, above all kinds of plants, reptiles, and even other mammals. So that's three predictions and apparently three failures for the flood model. Now, this, of course, is just a tiny fraction of the total evidence in the field. There's the magnetic striping of the ocean floor, more radiometric dating methods, the entire field of evolutionary biology, et cetera, et cetera. But hopefully this gives you just a little glimpse, and it's enough to show a trend. Now, a disclaimer, I'm not a geologist, I'm not a paleontologist, a biologist, and as you can clearly see from these slides, I'm not an artist either. I'm a mechanical and nuclear engineer. But what that means is that both Dr. Hovind and myself are laymen on these topics. We're not experts, unless he has some education that I'm unaware of.
1 minute.
Cool, thanks. That's why I posted my sources on the slides, which I encourage you to check out for yourself to ensure that I'm not misrepresenting the science. It's very easy to come up with a story that sounds good at first glance, particularly if your audience has no in-depth knowledge of the subject. It's much harder to present evidence that persuades relevant experts. So as we go on, I want you to listen to both of us very closely. Do we cite our sources? Are those sources peer-reviewed or scholarly, or are they just like blogs? Once the debate is done, check both of us. Make sure that both him and I are using our sources correctly, that we're accurately representing the research. In short, you should get your science from scientists. So I'm about done, so I'll just go ahead and see the rest of my time. Really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks.
All right. Thank you for that, Jordan. That was Jordan's opening statement. It's time for Dr. Hovind. Dr. Hovind, you have 10 minutes when you begin speaking.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming, Jordan. I'm sorry to hear that you switched from being a young Earth creationist to believing you came from a rock 4.6 billion years ago. I think you jumped out of the frying pan into the fire on that one. I'm always curious why a person such as yourself, who claims to be an atheist, what do they offer as replacement for the biblical creation view? They seem to always be looking to pick holes in what the Bible says. And yet, if you look at the only alternative to a creator is the world made itself. So I would assume you have chosen to believe, capital B, believe, in the evolution theory. And the Big Bang the universe had to come from somewhere. So I think you would be wise to really honestly look and say, do I really believe that a mosquito and a whale have a common ancestor? You really believe that? I mean, hello, wake up, son. Anyway, so the three lines of evidence you gave are things you want to talk about. Dating, I cover that if we can during Q&A. Maybe I have a lot of stuff on all the different dating methods: carbon dating, potassium, argon, rubidium, strontium, lead 208. I don't understand what you're thumbing for me. Oh, okay. All the different dating methods are based on some very obvious assumptions, Jordan. How much was in it when it started? Has the decay rate always been the same? Has there been no contamination? Those cannot be proven. You could, in a court of law, no dating method in an honest court of law, if such a thing exists, none of them would hold up. They would all be thrown out saying, look, there are too many assumptions. You can't know the initial content. You can't know there's not been any contamination, and you cannot know the I forgot. Oh, hey, brother, come in, brother. People coming in all the time around here. So I think there are so many variables on this that it's just not wise to call it science. It's wise to call it a belief. You can believe that if you'd like. There have been numerous examples, and I give lots of them, and I'll call them up if you need them, where wild dates have been obtained from samples, but the samples really are dated based on they're bracketed first on the geologic column, and they've admitted this for many years. What happened in 1830? Charles Lyell, a lawyer from Scotland who hated the Bible, wrote a book called The Principles of Geology, volume 1, 2, and 3. I got them on the shelf here. I don't see them now, but they're here. Anyway, These are the books that greatly influenced Charles Darwin to give up his faith. Darwin had gone to school to be an Anglican preacher, majored in theology, the only degree he ever got. And when these books were written by Charles Lyell, Darwin took one of them with him, or maybe it was sent to him on the Beagle as they sailed around the world for 5 years collecting bugs and birds. But Darwin thought, Charles Lyell really thought he was the cat's meow. He said, men of superior talent, he's talking about himself, who thought for themselves and were not blinded by authority. And Jordan, this is the same attitude you've picked up, okay, the scoffing attitude. False conclusions, futile reasoning, ancient doctrines. I'm sure you were taught in school that the Bible is an ancient goat herder's manual and all that stuff. I've heard all those things. And you rest on scriptural authority. And this is the kind of stuff they feed kids like you with going through school. And some of you swallow it. And I'm sorry. Page 41 of his book, he remarked of how much interest of religion as well as those of sound philosophy had suffered by mixing sacred writings with questions of physical science. And in your engineering training, I'm sure you're taught, physical science, the decay rates of these various objects, potassium, rubidium, strontium, lead 208, lead 206, carbon 14, etc. These decay rates are physical science, and they prove millions of years or tens of thousands, they prove the Bible wrong. That's what you were taught, and this was hammered into your head for probably years, okay? Lyell said, he reasoned philosophically against those who regarded a disordered state of Earth's crust as exhibiting signs of the wrath of God. This is a slap at Noah's flood, which is what you're going to do here tonight. And he said, if you believe the Bible, you have a religious prejudice. Lyell clearly said his goal was to free the science from Moses. In other words, get rid of the Bible explanation. Lyell's the primary guy who created what we call today the geologic column. It's been greatly modified, but you used it tonight. You got the Cretaceous, Jurassic, Triassic, Permian, Mississippian, Devonian, all that stuff. The geologic column can only be found one place in the world, and I think you should know that, Jordan. It's only found in the textbook. It's certainly not uniform all over the world. Out of these layers, there may be a random shuffling where occasionally you find a little section, but then you got to, how do you know it's a Jurassic layer? What's the difference between Jurassic limestone and Permian limestone or Mississippian limestone? They're all limestone. They determine which one they call it by what types of fossils they're found in there. Pure circular reasoning. What happened in the early 1800s, each of these layers was given a name, like Jurassic Park. It was given an age, 70 million years ago, and it was given an index fossil. So they said, if you find this fossil in this layer, this will be called Jurassic, or Triassic, or Mississippian, or Devonian, or Silurian. The whole thing was made up in the 1830s. The geologic column, does it exist? There's a great article on creation.com, just accessed a couple months ago, saying, no, the geologic column does not exist. Now, it is a fact the Earth has many layers of rock. It's a fact Grand Canyon exists. I've been there many times, flown down in it, rafted in it, climbed up and down. The Grand Canyon exists. That's not a question. There's two options. It formed slowly by a little bit of water and lots of time, or it formed quickly by lots of water and a little bit of time. I know this, if you watch Dam Break at Dinosaur Adventureland, you'll see our little dam washed out in 7 minutes. Grand Canyon, if you plugged it up, that would take a lot of dirt, but if you plugged up Grand Canyon, lakes would back up on the north side that would be 5,000 feet deep. You're an engineer, you know the pressure 5,000 feet of water exerts. Once it starts going over the top, it's going to not only erode, it's going to be abrasive because it'll pick up sand, gravel, clay. It'll be liquid sandpaper. So you have erosion and abrasion, and you'd also have cavitation. Rapidly moving fluids, air or water, can create cavitation, a suction on the material around it. So I think there are numerous factors with rapidly moving water that would form Grand Canyon probably in a week or two, not millions a year. It is a washed out spillway. It's a breached dam. Now, it's a fact the Earth has layers of rock. I agree. I've seen them. Taught Earth science 15 years. You guys believe that these layers form slowly and are different ages. And yet there's nice continuity, nice neat lines between them and polystrata fossils connecting them. I think it's ridiculous to believe those layers are millions of years different in age, but you can believe what you want. The creationist says, no, these layers are all from the flood in the days of Noah. And you guys who believe in evolution, believe, capital B, are constantly trying to erase this line and make your theory part of the fact. No, Jordan, it is a fact. The Earth has layers. It is not a fact. They're different ages by millions of years. The geologic column is actually the Bible for the evolutionist. You gave up on God's word to believe in a rock book. All these layers are different ages. It can only be found one place in the world, and that is the textbooks. I would like you to show me where I can actually see and study this geologic column And I'd like you to explain to me, why did they name the layers what they named them? If they find limestone and then limestone later and then limestone later, why did you name it Jurassic? Why not Mississippian limestone? It's because of the index fossils, and they know it. This textbook says if there were a column of sediments, unfortunately, no such column exists. There is no geologic column. It doesn't exist. They talk about the geologic strata and all these layers. This is what, if the geologic column existed in one place, it'd be 100 miles thick. This is lie number 7 in my series of 45 lies in the textbooks you can see on drdino.com. So they said this article is detailed examination of the young Earth creationist claim that the geologic column does not exist. It is shown that the entire geologic column exists in North Dakota. Oh, so they found one place on this giant world where they think the layers happen to be in that order. Of course, there's going to be just through random shuffling. And again, I'd like to challenge, how did they decide what to call those layers? How did they decide? This one is Mississippian, Devonian, Silurian. It's by the fossils. Anyway, hypersaline water. So I would talk about all this kind of stuff in my seminar. Okay. Index fossils may have been found in order in some place, but that's a result of random shuffling. It's going to happen. I can shuffle decks of cards and fling them out 5 million times and eventually get all the aces together. Yeah, that's random shuffling. So my position is these layers of strata that you see, for instance, in Grand Canyon, all had to be deposited very rapidly for multiple reasons. One, they're nice, neat layers stacked on top of each other. If that layer sat there for 4 million years waiting for the next one, don't you think there'd be some erosion marks in between the layers?
51 seconds.
Is it going to rain once in a while in 4 million years? I got 1 minute left. Okay. So my position is just simply shaking of mud and sediments and stuff like that, hydrologic sorting, would create all the layers that we see on the Earth in a matter of less than a year. We have these things at our Dinosaur Adventureland, and come on down, Jordan, I'll give you a tour of the place. You can flip this over. There are 4 different densities of sand, black, dark blue, light blue, white, and it makes 100 layers every time you do it. Water does that kind of thing. The bent layers indicate rapid deposition. The smooth gravel, all over the world, gravel is rounded. We live in a gravel pit here. I'll give you 1 billion rocks if you want. They were in a rock tumbler called Noah's Flood. So come on down. We'll be glad to explain all that to you from how the tide would have done rock tumbling all over the world. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Hovind. And we're into the 6-minute rebuttal period now. Jordan, you have 6 minutes to rebut, and your time begins when you start speaking.
All right, so Dr. Hovind spent a lot of time talking about this guy named Lyell, science from the 19th century, who was formative in the stratigraphy and the layers. I mean, that's awesome, but we don't base our science on people who lived in the 19th century. They may have started, but we stand on the shoulders of giants. So
yeah, you do.
I don't, I'm not going to defend his views or his arrogance because we've got plenty of work since then. So I'm going to focus on stuff that's more modern. In terms of replacing the biblical view, I replaced it with what I perceive to be the evidence. Talking about the Big Bang and whatnot is kind of off topic for this, but I have talked about it in other forums, and I'd be happy to do that. But I'm not going to go into that today. And just the dating assumptions. So it is true. Every model has assumptions. That's true of every model, whether it's creationist or not. Doesn't matter. All models have assumptions. Those assumptions may or may not be valid. You have to test them and ensure that they're valid before you want to use them. I gave reasons why the half-life has been constant. Physically speaking, it's not just that they hammered it and I just accepted and hit the I believe button on that. The reason that we can be confident the half-lives are constant, if the nucleus was a nickel, the nearest electron would be 3 miles away. The nucleus of especially heavy elements is very insulated from environmental pressures. So in the radioactive decay is mediated by the weak nuclear force, which is constant throughout the universe, or at least it appears to be so. So there's no real reason to think it would change. Now, there is one exception. That exception is electron capture. That is relevant for potassium dating, for instance. Because that is a method where the nearest electron falls into the nucleus, turns a proton into a neutron, emits a neutrino, and because it is based on the closeness of that electron that it impacts it, extremely high pressures have been shown, for instance, for beryllium-7 to change that dating or that the half-life by about 0.5%. And that's at pressures we'd experience miles and miles down, way deeper than we're doing any dating. So that assumption seems to be reasonable and supported. Initial conditions, different dates deal with that different ways. I talked about how uranium lead deals with it, with the non-radiogenic lead. You've got outgassing and then ways to deal with errors there. We can get more into that later, but it's a known problem, and it's a problem with solutions. If it didn't have solutions, we wouldn't do it. Non-contaminated, a lot of the times the contamination would actually make things younger. With uranium lead dating, for example, if the uranium were weathered away, it would stop decaying into lead. That would freeze the clock. So when we looked at it, it would be artificially young. A lot of the different dating methods are like that, so that doesn't really help. At least it may make the thing less accurate than we'd like. I mean, no method's going to be perfect. There's always error bars, but it certainly helps get rid of the 10,000-year-old age. For the types of layers, I am not a geologist, so I'm going to be relaying to you what I got from the experts. I don't claim any expertise in this field, so but what I've read from them in terms of the erosion marks, that's actually something that SFT hit me with when I debated with him, and I had to give the same kind of plea of ignorance. I looked into it, and apparently, according to geologists, there is evidence of erosion between layers. They're called unconformities. The one I think that you're most referencing is called a disconformity. According to the relevant literature, it's very difficult to recognize in a casual glance. So I defer to geologists and their expertise on that. But it is something that actually does happen. In terms of the way they named it, I don't know who was the creative guy who came up with the names. Probably that Lyle jerk, I guess. But it's my understanding, and I am not a geologist, so please do take these for the ravings of a drooling idiot. I think it's because of you can follow Steno's principles of stratigraphy. Layers are laid down consecutively because you can't lay them on air, and so you can track layers over large areas. And then you can make a construct, which is helpful for learning the geological column. It's not intended to mean this is the column that exists anytime you dig in the ground. That's, of course, not what it means. It means that if there had been no erosion, if it had happened everywhere, this is what it would look like. But reality is, of course, way more complex than that. That's why they have to spend 10 years getting their doctorate to become experts. Talk about the queen lines. The queen lines are sometimes an illusion. Look up disconformities. Polystrate fossils in the literature, they are called in situ fossils or T0 assemblages or upright fossils. There's a fantastic paper on this, 2011, by DeMichel and Falcon Lang, titled Pennsylvania Fossil Forests and Growth Position. So look that up. It really breaks down exactly how it happens. So basically, these are fossils that go through several layers of mud. For most of them, it means that they were buried rapidly from a geological standpoint. But you can see coal seams, which is the forest floor. So it appears that they were there. You can see the root systems. But the cool thing about this, the reason that it doesn't appear was one single event, is you can see multiple, in some places in that paper they describe it, multiple trees on top of each other. So you have a tree, it's buried, it's fossilized, and a little bit higher you have another tree, and it's buried, and it's also fossilized, and a little bit later. So I'm not sure how a flood would account for that. And lastly, just the whole scoffing attitude thing. I don't consider myself superior. I used to be a young Earth creationist. I changed my mind because of evidence, and I'd be happy to change it back. I just want to know the truth. This appears to be the truth from my best estimate. But if I got different evidence, then I would change my mind. And I hope everyone would embrace that view. And that's it.
All right. Thank you for that, Jordan. Now, Dr. Hovind, it's your turn to have 6 minutes for rebuttal when you begin.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Jordan, you mentioned they're difficult. The erosion marks between the layers are, you said, difficult to recognize. That's code word for only experts can find them. I have studied many of these layers. We have them here on our property. I live in a gravel pit. There are 7 layers of gravel that start here in Alabama and go to North Carolina. There are hundreds and probably maybe even thousands, but certainly hundreds of gravel pits between here and North Carolina, mining these same layers of gravel. Obviously, I think there was something huge that did that. And I don't know if you're aware of the stratigraphy work done in Colorado at the, I forget what it's called right now. No, it wasn't Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Anyway, when water's moving sideways, it'll drop off 6 or 8 or 10 layers simultaneously. So it'll look like the layers were deposited horizontally or vertically, but actually they're deposited horizontally, multiple layers. So you can actually get a layer at the bottom that's younger than a layer at the top, depending which way the water's flowing. And during Noah's flood, the tide would be flowing both directions. Now, I left off completely discussing fossils. I'm going to do my Whack an Atheist here in a few minutes when we're done. Tonight it's Richard Dawkins. Every Wednesday night on our YouTube, Kent Hovind Official, we do Whack an Atheist, like whack-a-mole, knock them back down. Richard, and I'll be glad to put you on the list if you'd like. And your friend, your other buddy. Why the profanity's in there, is that add intelligence or something? I don't know, but we'll see. Okay, Richard Dawkins says, show us your intermediate fossils, the skeptics say. There are plenty of intermediate fossils. That's what he said. Plenty of intermediate fossils. And I'll tell Richard tonight, and I'll tell you right now, fossils are not evidence for evolution. You cannot prove any fossil you find had any offspring. All you find are bones in the dirt. We have lots of fossils here. We have thousands of petrified clams in the closed position. Some of these are found on top of the Peruvian Andes Mountains. They're found on top of Mount Everest. When Edmund Hillary got there in 1953, they put their victory flag on top of the mountain. The top several hundred feet is petrified clams on top of Mount Everest. I think the flood model explains that pretty good. The Bible says toward the end of the flood, Psalm 104, the mountains arose, the valleys sank down. I believe the earth was completely covered in water, probably about a mile deep everywhere. Lots of stuff drowned, lots of fossils formed. And then during the last few months of the flood, the thin spots on the earth's crust would sink in, maybe a mile or two. The thicker spots would bounce up in response, like tipping a teeter-totter. And so the mountain ranges all over the world, it's interesting, the mountain ranges follow the coastline. The Rocky Mountains, the Pacific, the Appalachian Mountains, the North Atlantic, the Alps follow the Mediterranean. So I think the mountain ranges and the ocean basins formed at the same time because of the same feature. Sections of land would tip. I mean, if you get a 2,000-mile piece of land to tip 1 mile, we're talking 0.05%. So and that would let the water rush off, and the rushing of the water would form the canyons through the soft mud very rapidly and bury lots of fossils. How many animals died today around the world? Like billions, and none are going to fossilize. But it's not hard to find fossils, Jordan. They're everywhere. Fossils are everywhere. So I think the best explanation for fossils at all is A, rapid burial in mud and preservation from decay long enough for them to be either replacement fossil with mineralization of the bone, or a casing, in the case of an impression fossil. But you cannot prove any fossil. I cannot prove this clam had any children. You can't, in a court of law, they throw it out and say, I'm sorry, you can't prove this had any children. Secondly, you cannot prove it had any fossil, it had any offspring that lived. It might have had children, but they all died. Thirdly, you could not prove any fossil in the world had any offspring that lived that were different. Who would the imaginary different offspring mate with? Let's suppose you do get a bone in the dirt that's able to produce something different than itself. Who is it going to marry? You got to get two at the same time of the opposite sex in the same place, and they got to find each other and be interested. And then you got to replace the whole population of other ones with those two new ones that have the new improved species, improvement. It's just not science. Secondly, why would anyone believe that bones in the dirt could do something no plant or animal today can do? Produce offspring that are different. No farmer's ever seen a cow produce a non-cow. Nobody's ever seen a dog produce a non-dog or a chicken produce a non-chicken. It's never been seen. So you have chosen to put your faith, your belief, in the completely unseen theory that animals can change to something else. Nobody's ever seen that. I feel sorry for you. I think you gave up the only thing that's logical, God's word, to accept something illogical. Last thing you said,
1 minute.
All models have assumptions. I agree. The creation model has assumptions. I assume there's a creator. I assume there was a worldwide flood. I think the evidence points that way. I cannot prove that in a court of law. And you cannot prove that mosquitoes and whales are related. You can believe that because of whatever reasons you want. And you can believe we all came from a dot of nothing 13.772 billion years ago, but it's not science. So my question would be very simple. Since neither creationists nor evolutionists can technically prove scientifically their point, why are we all forced to pay for your religion to be taught? Because evolution is a religious belief. You've chosen to believe it on faith. Nobody's ever seen a dog produce a non-dog. But you do believe a dog and a mosquito are related. It's fine. You can believe that. I don't care. I don't think it's science. I don't think it's smart. I don't think it's common sense. But I do object to paying to have the kids taught that like it is part of science. It's not part of science. Evolution should be taught in a religion class, if it should be taught at all. Okay, go ahead.
All right, thank you. That's Dr. Hovind's rebuttal period. Now we're going to have a 20-minute open discussion period. And after that, we'll have our closing statements. So you guys have 20 minutes to talk. Let me set my timer for 20 minutes. And we'll have a nice cordial conversation about uniformitarianism or versus the flood. How's that? Starting now.
Sure. I just wanted to answer the whole profanity thing. Jared and I are both veterans, so we just can't help it. It just happens.
No, we'll see. We'll see if God accepts that excuse one day. I spent 9 years in prison. I heard plenty of profanity. To me, it shows stupidity, not intelligence. But go ahead.
You have to use it creatively.
You guys put things in your mouth. I wouldn't hold in my hand, but that's all right.
Do you have anything you want to start with? We can roll from there if you want.
Well, maybe the layers. Well, you said you're not an expert in the geologic column, but I can show you pictures. Maybe it said you've seen my seminar of petrified trees standing up, running through two different seams of coal. I should call that up here, but I got 14,000 slides. But if you have a tree standing up, running through a seam of coal, 5 or 6 layers of rock, and then a different seam of coal. Up in North Alabama, they find a lot of them, the Mary Lee Formation and the Blue Creek Formation, both layers of coal. According to the theory, a forest has to grow. The trees have to get compacted, turned to coal over millions of years or some amount of time, and then more layers deposited on top, and then a whole new forest has to grow. And yet there are no roots into the layers below, none. And the tree, I'll just call it up here. The tree is connecting 2 layers. Let's see. Geologic column. It's better if they ask the questions in the same order that I have my answers. That would help a lot.
Well, while you're pulling it up,
anyway,
the picture.
Polystrate fossils going through 2 different seams of coal, I think, completely negates the idea that you were taught that this can be answered. I don't think there's a possible answer for that other than all the layers formed in less than a year, which you would get. How many layers just formed on this thing in the last 10 minutes while I let it sit here?
So I'll give you
20?
the answer. That's my understanding, and I am not a geologist,
okay.
so please get your geology from geologists. But my understanding would be that the tree would be buried at least part of the way, and that would cause the first coal seam eventually after it compacts. But all that's necessary for the tree to fossilize is that it's buried faster than it decays, and trees can last without decaying for sometimes years and decades. It depends on the tree and the conditions.
I agree.
So my understanding as a layman would be that you'd bury the original tree, another forest bed would begin to grow, and then being in a situation where it's likely to be buried, that's evidenced by it happening once, it gets buried again. And so you'd have the appearance of this tree buried once, buried however many times, and you'd have another coal seam buried again. That would be my understanding. How would that happen with a second coal seam, though, in the flood? Like, what would that represent?
Well, during the flood, you would get log mats as big as Texas floating back and forth across the ocean, being carried back and forth with the tide. I mean, the flood would rip up trillions of trees, and they would tend to float in log mats in the vertical position, a horizontal position. So as any log mat floats around, certain types of wood, or depending how bad it's fractured from being twisted out of the ground, will be waterlogged faster than others, and they'll sink to the bottom. Mount St. Helens has multiple layers forming at the bottom of Spirit Lake, and it had only been 40 years since the volcano erupted. Here's a petrified tree standing up, running through multiple layers. Here's a person standing next to a petrified tree. These layers that are running right up to the tree do not have any signs of being inclusion, being pushed into place, or being shifted in any way. The layers are nice, neat, smooth layers. I've been to see them in Yellowstone National Park. There are 27 layers of wood standing up, many of them broken off, like this one here, Yellowstone National Park. Petrified trees in the standing position. You can watch my video number 4. Here's the coal mine in North Alabama, where they find one of the guys who works there, Dr. Donald McDonald, Troy State University, wrote to me and said, "Can't we find them all the time?" He works in the coal mine, digging for the coal. There they are right there, digging out the seams of coal. He said, "You'll find petrified trees. Sometimes the tree is sitting right on top of a seam of coal, no roots whatsoever, just like sitting there. This one was running way up here, and the rest of it broke off." So the Mary Lee and the Blue Creek Formation are coal seams up in North Alabama here. We don't have any coal down here that I'm aware of, but in our gravel pit. But if you look at the fossils that are found, Don sent me this. He said, "Kent, we got fossil A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. And if you put them all together, tree H runs up through the Mary Lee Formation. tree A runs through the Blue Creek Formation, but yet they also both run through this layer in between. Hold it. That's scientific evidence that those layers had to form before either tree could decay completely, which would certainly be less than millions of years, maybe 10 or 20 years. Under mud, maybe preserved a little longer. Here's one that is running through a seam of coal at the bottom. This is in Tennessee, a different seam of coal at the top. And in between are these layers budded right up to it. Now, I know what you were taught. I was taught the same stuff. These layers form slowly over millions of years. First of all, they tell you the top layer is younger than the bottom layer. I say, stop right there. Think about it. Where's this top layer coming from? Outer space? All these layers were in this glass thing at the same time. They're sorted by hydrologic sorting, but you can't say the top layer is younger than the bottom layer.
All right. So
all the layers are the same age.
You've hit a lot of things. So let me try to hit some of them.
Go ahead.
So trees don't decay immediately. All that's required is that they're buried before they decay. And I don't see why that would be an issue in my model. It just means that they have to be buried quickly, geologically speaking. You can have floods. There just don't need to be global floods. So I don't see why that's a particular issue. I would wonder why, if things are floating, so obviously plants float when there's a flood and whatnot, why we wouldn't see a bias of plants. Like, why do we have plants all throughout the fossil record? Why doesn't it appear that they were deposited selectively by floating? That would be a question. You hit a lot of stuff. I lost track of a lot of it. So
yeah, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, so I don't know. I lost track of any other point you might have made if there's something I missed.
Okay,
you said.
Let me object and say there's no such thing as a fossil record. There are fossils, lots of fossils. We have thousands in our museum, but there's not a record. None of them have a date stamped on them. None of them can talk. So somebody's putting their interpretation on them.
Yeah, but
they would say
case.
This clam is found in the Jurassic layer, so therefore it is 70 million years old. It doesn't say 70 million on it. Somebody put their interpretation on it, and you can believe their interpretation if you'd like.
But that's
a
the case.
Clam it had to be buried alive. It's closed, Jordan. Clam.
That's first of all, that wouldn't be. So you have to look at a model with its predictions, and
I agree.
Right. So it wouldn't be a prediction of my model, or when I say my, I mean the scientific community's, the uniformitarian model, that all the clams would suddenly spring open as soon as they die. I have a quote. The clams do open as the muscles relax, but if they were buried quickly, which fossils are evidence of being buried quicker than they could decay, Roger Portell, the Invertebrate Paleontology Collections Director at the Florida Museum of Natural History, says as clams die, fine sediment and particles wash inside. As more sediment settles on top of the clams over time, they close, becoming excellent long-term storage containers. So what's happening is the clam is buried and dies. It starts to open, but sediment is being packed on top. That would tend to force it close in some cases. So having fossilized closed clams, say that 10 times fast, doesn't refute anything in my model. And it is definitely true that when I say fossil record, what I mean is the observation of these fossils as we present them and as have been ordered by paleontologists. You have to put an interpretation on evidence you see. So it's not a matter of proving. You only have proofs and math. What you need to do is test it to see if predictions are disconfirmed, and if the predictions are not disconfirmed, then the model is more likely to be true, subject to future evidence. So it doesn't bother me that I don't know. I don't expect to know. I expect to go with what's probable.
Okay. I would make a prediction that a log in the mud would probably decay in less than 100 years. I think it'd be hard-pressed to find any tree under mud for 100 years that is still intact, especially since many of them still have the bark on them. But in rolling back and forth, they saw with Mount St. Helens blowing all the trees into Spirit Lake. They said probably 20,000 trees got blown into Spirit Lake. When I was up there, my sister lives up near there. It's amazing what that volcano did. But those trees, every time the wind blows, they roll back and they slide back and forth on the water. The wind blows them to one end, back. So they're always rolling against each other. The bark rolled off pretty quickly and settled to the bottom. That's going to form a layer of coal. Coal can be made in the laboratory in a couple of weeks under heat and pressure. That's all you need to convert the cellulose into coal. It's just a different form of cellulose, basically. But which of course is greatly going to affect the carbon decay rate. But I would predict if we look at these trees with a magnifying glass where the layers meet the tree, there will be no example, you will not find evidence of them being pushed in, intruded. You will find evidence of these layers being rapidly deposited. And I predict you will find the top layer is not rotted or decayed more than this layer. If it's stuck in the mud at the bottom and these layers form slowly, you would see if the top part is exposed for any amount of months or years, you're going to see more and more decay. The tree should be rotting coming in, should be getting smaller at the top, not just because of the way trees grow, but because of rotting wood, and that's not evidenced.
So
the layers at the
I'm not a geologist, but I think I know how that would work. So as the tree is being deposited, again, these layers can deposit quickly. So it's not that a quickly depositing layer invalidates my model. Some layers do deposit quite quickly. But if the tree rotted to the point when it's exposed that it wouldn't have any structural integrity, the next slide is going to shear that off. That's why you see these trees with a sheared top. That's exactly what happens. So the prediction, I mean, that's correct, but it doesn't invalidate the model. But again, I'm not a geologist, so my understanding of that is very limited. If I could talk about the half-lives, because you mentioned that a couple times. So what mechanism, aside from electron capture, which pressure can change, so setting that aside, what mechanism would change the half-lives for these other decay patterns, and what evidence do you have of that being observed?
Well, I think we have all sorts of examples of things that are dated by the layer that they're found in, and then when they do carbon date them, or potassium, argon, or rubidium, strontium, they find wild errors. So which one are you going to count? Back in 1976, they knew from American Journal of Science, radiometric dating would not have been feasible if the geologic column had not been erected first. Oh, whoa, what's he saying here? You have to bracket the date you're looking for. If I took this to a university and said, how old is this clam? First question they would ask, where did you find it? What difference does that make where I found it? Take a piece of coal to any university and say, how old is this? Would you carbon date it? Because coal contains carbon. And you know full well, Jordan, if coal is 220 million years old, there'd be no carbon-14 left in it with a half-life of 5,730 years. But coal still contains carbon-14, doesn't it? It's not millions of years old. But the first question they're going to ask is, where did you find it? Like, what difference does that make where I found it? They have to bracket it first with the geologic column. This is pure circular reasoning, and a first grader can figure that out.
Fossils
have been, and go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Well, you have to determine the method to use in order to date it.
Now, stop and think what you're saying. You have to bracket the age by the geologic column to decide if you should use potassium or rubidium or strontium or lead-208 or lead. You're saying exactly what I pointed out. This is the hypocrisy of the whole thing.
Allow me to
speak. You
speak.
have to first decide how old.
Allow me to speak more precisely.
You can't decide.
Okay. So when I say you need to decide what method to use, I mean methods are expensive, and you just don't throw every method at every fossil because we'd run out of money. So it's kind of like if you found that fossil so far down, it would be a waste. Well, it would be a waste of time to date a fossil with carbon dating anyway, because there's no carbon in it. But if you find something,
what if it contained carbon? Carbon dating costs about $500, if I recall.
You can test it, and if you find significant amounts of carbon that can't be explained by other sources, such as uranium decay, then you can publish those sources, and you'll revolutionize the dating world. I don't expect that'll happen. It's not like they're being dishonest by this bracketing. If you wanted to pay for all the different methods, and they often use different methods, then you can do that. It's not like they're hiding from it. It's just it's unreasonable to expect them to date every single sample with every single method.
Okay, are you aware of, is it Jack Horner or John Horner that has the museum in Montana? He has the dinosaur bone that was found with soft tissue still in it. He has it in his possession. A guy called him and they recorded the call. He said, Mr. Horner, would you please carbon date that dinosaur bone because it has soft tissue, which would still contain carbon. He said, no, I won't do it. They said, we'll pay you $20,000 if you will carbon date it. we'll pay for the testing, $2,000 or whatever it was, plus we'll pay $20,000 if you'll carbon date it. Just a donation to your museum. He said, no, I can't do that. He said, why not? He said, because we know it's too old. This is such blatant prejudice and blindness. It's got soft tissue. For heaven's sake, it's got carbon. He was offered $25,000 to carbon date it. What would be wrong with carbon dating a dinosaur bone?
It would destroy
because it's too old.
Well, it would destroy parts of the sample.
Old, right?
It would destroy parts of the sample. As you know, samples that are that well preserved are extremely rare. So you're not just going to throw this sample in the trash. It doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, if you found the sample, you could do whatever you wanted with it. No one's going to stop you from doing it. But you can't expect to light this other guy's fossil on fire and him being okay with that. But you still haven't given me a way. Give me a mechanism by which these half-lives are going to change. What's your mechanism?
Well, there was an article published, I don't have it in front of me here, but a couple years ago, they took under extreme heat and pressure and got, I think it was, I forget which of the long dating methods, the long age ones, to decay in a few seconds. It went from 1.4 billion, I guess it'd be potassium to argon, whichever, if that's the right number. It instead of 1.4 billion years to go half of it to decay, just in a few seconds under heat and pressure. Would you agree that extreme heat and extreme pressure could influence all the dating methods?
No, because potassium argon dating decays by electron capture. As I mentioned earlier, that is shown to be slightly vulnerable to pressures. So setting that one aside, because pressures can affect the orbitals of electrons, so that dating method, got it. Setting that one aside.
So can temperature. So can temperature.
Okay.
Temperature can affect the orbitals of electrons. Go ahead.
Sure. So that method, setting it aside just for the sake of argument, what about all of the other methods? How are the half-lives of those changing? Since they are not shown to be vulnerable to temperature and pressure, and there's no reason we'd expect they would be.
Let's start with your assumption. Carbon-14 is not vulnerable to anything.
3 minutes,
Then date
gentlemen.
the dinosaur bone that they found with soft tissue in it. They found a dinosaur bone with soft. Several have been found. It's not like it's rare, and it doesn't take that much of the sample to test. It wouldn't destroy the whole fossil and set it on fire. They got a dinosaur bone with soft tissue in it. Take 2% of it, dedicate it to science, and you got a guy offering $20,000 donation to your museum. I tell you why Horner doesn't want to do it. It would destroy the evolution theory, because it would come back just a few thousand years old, because that's all carbon dating does. But if carbon-14 indeed decays to carbon-12 at a known half rate of 5,730 years, if that is indeed true, and indeed that bone is 70 million years old, there should be no carbon-14 left. I'll be willing to bet you $100, that's about all I can afford, that there's carbon-14 in that dinosaur bone.
If I had a dinosaur bone, to give you, Dr. Hovind, I'd give it to you. And I'd expect.
You would?
Yeah, I would. I just don't have one. I don't expect I'll get one. But
we
if I
have
do,
some fragments here.
I do, I'll give it to you. So I'd expect that test to come with some small amount of residual carbon from contaminants. And when you get below represented ages of 50,000 years or less, you're starting to get into the error bars. So that's not a significant amount of carbon. I would expect that there would be no statistically significant amount of carbon-14, unless
I will predict it'll have significant. I'll predict it'll have significant amounts of carbon-14, way beyond the error range. And I would predict if it was demonstrated that a dinosaur bone had carbon-14 still in it, significant amounts, and you could isolate all the contamination effects by digging down deep enough into the bone, into the marrow, someplace where it was not contaminated. And if it could be contaminated, how do you know all the other samples they've taken over the years were not contaminated? Why would you isolate one age and throw it out when let's throw them all out then?
By contamination, I mean no sample is going to be perfectly clean. You're going to have some level of contamination, but they have rigorous lab procedures, as I'm sure you know, to try to minimize that to the greatest extent possible. So if you ever find an offer on that, I'll throw in $100 of my own money to get that to happen. So I'm pretty confident. And if it isn't, I want to know.
Okay, I think you're correct. You really do want to know. I think you got taught something that drew you away from Christianity. And I think you made a giant mistake. Now, all of this argument tonight, the geologic column and the carbon radioactive dating methods, is all about really one thing: great age. You guys have to get frantic when they start attacking the idea that the Earth is billions of years old, because without billions of years, your theory falls apart. But this is
Gentlemen,
only the first hurdle you have to overcome. You
that's
have to have
about the
billions
end.
of years for your frog to turn to a prince.
Gentlemen, that's about
This is
the end
only
of
the
the
first obstacle.
discussion period.
Okay.
Let's give each one of you 30 seconds to finish up your thoughts. Since Jordan, you began the discussion, give a 30-second summary of your thoughts in this discussion, 20-minute discussion period, and then we'll get Dr. Hovind to do the same thing, and then we'll move on from there.
Is this my closing statement?
No, our
Okay.
closing statements are to come. Just give
Gotcha.
a 30-second, overview of what your thoughts are on the discussion, and we'll give Dr. Hovind the same thing, and then we'll move to the.
I don't get frantic when someone comes with evidence that might contradict something I believe. I am demonstrably willing to change my beliefs based on the evidence. So I don't get frantic. I just get interested. It's not about being able to prove something with 100% certainty. If you wait for 100%, you will never get anything. It's about what's probable, what's plausible, and just making the best predictions you can and being willing to change your mind. That's what it's all about.
Okay, Dr. Hovind, if you'd like, for 30 seconds, you can summarize your thoughts about the open discussion period, what you talked about, and then we'll move to closing statements.
Sure. I think it's pretty obvious that there are numerous examples where the carbon dating, none of the dating methods have been proven to work 100% of the time, or even they come up with some really wild dates, and they won't date that dinosaur bone because they know full well what'll happen. And the great age, which is really the whole tonight discussion is about, is essential for evolution. Just this one point, if it could be proven the Earth is not billions of years old, the entire evolution theory collapses in a heap. And they know it, and I know it. And they don't want that because they like evolution, because it gives them freedom from God's rules for, like they don't like the thou shalt not commit adultery and those kind of things. So that's really why they're frantic to hang on to this thing. So if you're really honest, Jordan, I think you are, we'll get you converted right back to young Earth creationist.
Cool.
Okay?
All right. So now it's time for closing statements. Nobody told me how long the closing statements would be.
It's short.
It's 5 minutes. Is that appropriate for you, fellas?
I'll just need a minute or two.
Okay. Well, how about a minute or two? Well, that would be awful short. Maybe Dr. Hovind might like to use more than a minute or
he
two.
could 5 if he wants it. Good. I don't care.
Forget the clock. Just let him go as long as he wants.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay.
You want me to go first? So traditionally in closing, you relitigate the arguments and try to get in some parting jabs or whatever. But this is YouTube, so you can just replay the debate if you want to hear what my arguments were. Instead, I just want to ask, I want all the listeners to ask yourselves, if I was wrong, would I want to know it? For me, that answer is yes. And if your answer is yes too, the next time you hear something that evolutionists, in air quotes, supposedly believe that seems stupid, ask the question, is that actually what they believe? And if so, why? Is it that they're all morons, or they're all deluded, or they're all afraid, or whatever? Or is it possible that maybe I'm just missing something? Maybe there's more to it than I've got right now. And then go find out. That's the next essential step. See what the actual scientists have to say. Hear what their model is. Take a course online. MIT offers them for free. You have absolutely nothing to fear from asking questions. One of the best parts about being skeptical is that if you ever find out you're wrong, just change your mind. Bam, you're not wrong anymore, like magic. So if you'd like to hear more about skepticism, how to ask questions, how to look at the good peer-reviewed evidence, head on over to Reason 2, the number 2, Doubt, our podcast. You can find us on Facebook, on iTunes. We cover everything, like I said, from aliens to anti-vaxxers. We have a ton of fun. So So this was a blast. Thanks for inviting me. And that's it.
Okay, Dr. Hovind, your closing statement, sir.
Well, thank you. I hope you do really have reasons to doubt, because you need to start doubting this theory you've been taught, that a mosquito and a whale both came from an amoeba 3.5 billion years ago from a pond of water which formed on a molten rock 4.6 billion years ago, which came from a dot of nothing. I think it's time you start doubting that. And so, whoa, what have I been sucked into here? I think the flat earthers ought to stop and slap themselves and say, what have I been sucked into here? You got sucked into one of the dumbest ideas in the history of the world, that we all came from a rock. Anyway, I agree. But you mentioned several times that about peer-reviewed articles or nothing to fear from asking questions or ask actual scientists. I think if you went to North Korea and did a survey, you would find everybody there believes in communism. Because if you don't, you get executed. I think you'll find in America, the academic circles, if you don't accept and at least toe the party line with this evolution stuff, you will get excommunicated from the temples of higher learning. So I think it's not execution yet, but it is certainly academic Siberia. If you dare to even question the evolution theory, I think your reasons to doubt ought to investigate. Why is there such a prejudice against the idea that there's a God? What would be wrong with there being a God creating these things? I have no idea who made this pen, but I'd be willing to bet $100 somebody made it. These things don't happen by chance. And if you look at your human body, look at a single cell. You're an engineer, for heaven's sake. Do you think a cell could create itself by chance over billions of years? Do you really, really believe that? Son, wake up, okay? Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move then to a question and answer session. Standing for Truth has questions already saved that I guess he received from people, and he's going to read off the questions to you. So I'm just going to step back and hand it over to Standing for Truth. He's going to ask the questions, and you fellows can give your response to them. Standing for Truth, you ready, brother?
Yes, brother. Thanks so much to the debaters for a great debate. Very lively. We had a really big audience tonight with a ton of questions. We are just at the hour mark, so I don't want to keep the debaters too late. So I'm just going to pick 2 questions for each debater from the audience. So we'll end it quick. We'll end it really quick. I'm just going to pick a couple questions here. At random. This one is for Dr. Hovind from James Downard. He asks, has Kent studied the technical criticism of accelerated decay? I think he's referring to a possible heat problem in the global flood model. Go ahead, Dr. Hovind.
I guess I'd like to see what problem he's talking about. I'm not aware of anything that can't be answered so far. I've not seen any technical problems with the flood model. The Bible says certainly there was a flood, and the Bible, if you look at the Bible model, there was water under the crust of the earth, according to Genesis chapter 1. The earth was founded on the water and in the water. So the water in the crust would be superheated. It would crack out through the fault lines and come to the surface, and the superheated water would kill everything within 100 mile or some effective radius of the cracks. And that was where the fault lines are. There's a great website by Walt Brown, creationscience.com, that deals a lot with that, the subterranean water. And the superheating of the water jetting out under intense pressure from 10 miles of rock on top, I think can explain lots of things that we see with the chemistry of the ocean and the chemistry of some of the fossils that are found, but that's be a long discussion on that. So I guess I'm not aware of any problems with the flood model that can't be answered. So I'd like to see a more specific.
Awesome. Okay, thanks for that answer there, Dr. Hovind. This one is for Jordan. It's from Rock Art in the chat. He asks, let me see here. John Baumgartner predicted cold slabs under the earth if they had been subducted just 4,000 years ago. These predictions have come true. Why do evolutionists ignore this? Go ahead, Jordan.
Again, I'm not a geologist. That's not my area of expertise. So I'm not familiar with all the literature. My understanding as a layman, but knowing heat transfer, would be you'd expect some amount of cold slabs in the magma because heat transfer takes time. And as it's continually moving, as parts of it is melting, you'd get more fed in. That's my understanding as a layman, but I'm just a drooling idiot when it comes to that field. Go talk to a geologist.
Okay, if we're done with that question, I just got one more for each of the debaters. So this one is for Kent. Has any creationist ever presented arguments for how strata became rock lithification? I just read that.
I can make strata in my yard in a few minutes. You get a layer of mud, you lay it out in the sun, it turns to rock. I mean, almost all the sedimentary rock was at one time in the semi-liquid or liquid form. Limestone, obviously, slate, shale, all the different, not igneous rock, but all the sedimentary rock, of which 75% of the earth, I think, is covered by sedimentary rock. It was mud at one time. We got layer after layer right here on our property. This was a gravel pit for 50 years. They dug gravel, sand, and clay out of here. We have layers of clay like 4 or 5 inches thick that just go for hundreds of feet. Just modeling clay like you'd buy at Walmart. So yeah, the stratification, we can make strata in minutes. Take some mud, get some clay, mix it with water, make a paste out of it, lay it out in the sun. You can make strata in, well, a couple hours, maybe not minutes, but depending how hot it is that day. It gets hot down here in Alabama. I could probably make it in about an hour. Come on down, I'll make some for you.
Okay, thanks for that answer. Right before this last question, I do want to thank you, gentlemen, for staying slightly over time. It's been a really good debate. Like I said, a big audience today. Everybody enjoyed. So this last question is for Jordan. It's from Philip in the chat. He asks, where did the energy come from to form a singularity and for it to expand? If you don't accept creation, you still can't rule out the possibility of the supernatural. Go ahead, Jordan.
So I actually did a debate on my buddy Titus's podcast, Proselytize or Apostatize, on the Kalam cosmological argument, and so I kind of covered that there. Really briefly, there are cosmological models. The short answer is we don't know. Nobody knows the precise mechanism that the Big Bang used. It's a kind of a placeholder. Probably won't have that figured out until we have quantum gravity figured out, and I am not a physicist. But from my understanding, there are cosmological models that are infinite. So, for example, if the gravitational constant is such that the universe is almost flat, you can have the negative energy that comes from gravity, which appears to precisely cancel out the positive energy you get from matter and light, and so you might have a zero energy universe, in which case you wouldn't need any energy, the ultimate free lunch. Is that true? Is that actually what happened? We don't know. And if anybody has more questions, hit me up on Facebook, reasonodoubt.com. I'll answer all of them. Not.com, facebook.com, but Reason to Doubt. So that's it. That's all I had.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that answer there, Jordan. Yeah, thanks again, gentlemen, for a really good debate. Time has flown by. I'm going to throw it over to, actually, before I give it to Praise to shut it down, did the debaters have any closing statements? Did you guys want to plug in your channels or anything like that before we?
Thanks for coming out, Ken. I know you had a lot. Your schedule's super busy, so thanks for doing this. It was awesome.
Yeah, well, thank you. And come down and visit Dinosaur Adventureland in Lenox, Alabama. It's a free Christian campground. We have all kinds of stuff. We have a science center. You can see all kinds of stuff about science and the Bible. And we believe the Bible's true. And you're going to be judged one day, son. I want to get ready for that day. I predict you'll be dead for a really long time.
I agree.
Long time. Okay. All right.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was a good debate. You handled yourselves very cordially. It was a very pleasant debate to watch, and I applaud both of you. Thank you so much for it.
All right. Thanks, guys. It was awesome.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks
Okay.
so much, guys. God bless. Is that it? We're done?
For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.